No heat, no shelter, no mercy. That was the country's winter face in the early 1930s. A face that didn't blink at men in threadbare coats or families moving like ghosts along cinder rights-of-way. On nights when the thermometer fell past zero and kept dropping, boxcars turned into steel coffins with splinters. The rails didn't rage. They didn't bargain. They just ran. Jack Morgan had promised himself he wouldn't sleep. Not here, not tonight. He'd boarded near a freight yard south of Chicago on a dare, whispered only to himself. Either you ride or you quit pretending you can. Within minutes, the car's floor began its old theft, sucking heat straight out of him, and the air hardened into glass that snapped in his lungs when he breathed too fast. He curled tighter, the way you do when you realize your body still knows more about staying alive than your pride does. Somewhere beyond the rattling slats, winter blue razors, a sulfur flare rasped to life. Not a lantern too bright, too noticeable, but a match held sideways in a palm that looked more like rope than skin. The match threw a small, stubborn coin of light. Behind it was a face grained like oak and nicked with time. "Don't take this wrong," the man said, voice low and practical as a wrench. "But you'll be a corpse before Omaha if we don't fix you." He pinched the match out. The dark came back with teeth. "Who?" "Folks call me Ledger," the stranger said, "because I keep accounts with the weather. It takes, I take back." The accent was mostly Midwest with a little sun-bleached West in the vowels. Like he'd learned to talk on both ends of America and split the difference. "You're soaked. Bad start." "I'm not." Jack meant to say I'm fine, because that lie is always the first coat you put on. Instead, what came out was a freighted stutter and the small animal sound you make when your fingers stop obeying. Save. That wind for your heart. Ledger's hands, those rope hands, were already digging in a sack. Dry newspaper folded into flats. A roll of cloth strips cut from shirts. A square of oiled canvas. "Take off the coat." Jack blinked. "Remove the one warm thing he had." "It's freezing." "Not freezing," Ledger said. "Stealing." "That cotton's wet." "Wet doesn't keep you warm. It steals. You want to live, you change the thieving rules." He didn't wait for permission. A knife flashed, just the quick, practical kind. A blade that had opened more cans than argument sand popped Jack's coat buttons, free like brittle teeth. The coat came off with a damp cough. "I only have had," Ledger said, already working the newspaper. His voice was a series of small instructions dressed as conversation. "You'll have better in 5 minutes. Don't move." The first layer wrapped Jack's torso like a second crinkling skin. Not just around Ledger, it overlapped each sheet 3/4 over the last. North-south, then east-west, then diagonal, the way a sailor might lash canvas for a gale. "No holes," Ledger murmured. "No chimneys. Taillights for heat to drive out." He tied each band snug, but not strangling with the cloth strips. Checked the color of Jack's fingertips in the match glow. Rewrapped, checked again. When the match burned down, he lit another with the old hobo moves striking against his own thumbnail and kept going. "Breathe slow," Ledger said. "You breathe too quick. Your furnace throws too much out the stack." "My what?" "Furnace. That's what you are. Skin's just brick around it. Newspapers, the space between. Air's the insulator, not the paper. Paper just keeps the air from running away." Jack tried to nod without tearing the seams. His jaw chattered so violently it felt like he was trying to shake yes out of his skull. Ledger wrapped the elbows like hinges that would have to flex under load, then bandaged Jack's knees the same way, each with a reinforcement made of canvas triangles. Any place metal bends is where it cracks, he said. Same with men. He worked the legs, shin to thigh, thigh to hip, the pattern methodical and fast. I learned this on a Montana night that could have iced fire, Ledger said, easy, as if story was also insulation. Lost 2 boys to pride before I learned the lesson. Pride tells a man he's warm enough. Pride's a liar in February. You talk like a teacher, Jack managed. The shakes were less now, the pain returning in waves that proved there was still blood bothersome enough to move. Ledger grunted. I talk like a man who's miscounted his friends in spring. He slid socks wool, merciful Wolliver Jack's newspaper hands, then jammed those into cut-down burlap mitts that he cinched inside the sleeves to keep wind from worming in. 4 feet he did worse magic. Dried Jack's with a rag he'd kept against his own chest like a relic. Wrapped the toes in paper with a ballerina's precision, then nested 3 different socks and slid them into boots a size too big. He stuffed the empty space with more paper and a strip of blanket. Loose for blood, tight for wind, balance, banker. How do you, Jack stopped? Why do you carry all this? Because I like my friends breathing, Ledger said. And I like my strangers better when they're not ghosts. He wrapped Jack's head last. Not a mummy. Ledger left a narrow eye-slit and a mouth opening small as a nickel, then built a scarf gate that could hinge up when he spoke and lock down when he didn't. 40% of a fool runs out his scalp, he said, tugging the wool cap over the newspaper crown. Filter the air. Don't knife your lungs. When Ledger slid an oversized coat over everything, the world changed temperature. Not warm, never warm, but suddenly survivable. The tremor in Jack's bones receded from earthquake to aftershock. Better, Ledger said, satisfied. He handed Jack the oiled cloth bag. Inside it, spare paper, more strips, a little stub of candle, a coil of twine, a rusty spoon, a folded tin cup flattened by 1,000 careful steps. That's a pocket winter. What do I owe you? Questions later, Ledger said, already crawling toward the door seam. He set a thumbnail window with his knife, the slit just big enough to read the wind. You're on a grain car now. That helps some. Walls are thicker. But we need a corner shelter or you'll leak heat like a drunk leaks. Apologies. Jack let out a laugh that surprised him with its own life. That a thing you learned from Montana? From everywhere, Ledger said. Rule 1, learn fast or freeze slow. The train drummed its iron lullaby through the floorboards. Ledger counted the beats with his eyes closed, the way musicians do. We're easing. Not a yard yet, just a water stop, I'd bet. Bulls sometimes walk the line at these. We build quiet balls. Rail cops. Some decent, some mean. All cold with a job to do. He slid back and began braiding short slats into a triangle frame with twine. Where did the slats come from? Jack didn't ask. Ledger worked like a man who collected tomorrow before anyone else woke up. He anchored the frame into the corner posts, set another across like a ridge, then stretched canvas over the frame drum-tight, tying at 4 points and then 8. Flapping's a tattletale, he said. You let your shelter talk, bulls come to listen. Behind canvas came blankets. Behind blankets came of coarse newspaper, stapled to the canvas with twine stitches and spitzlick knots. He left a low entrance on the side, away from the door, slit and rigged it with a twine pull so it could seal from the inside. The floor, cardboard over paper over a thin blanket. Edges lapped up like a shallow tub, so cold couldn't pour in. Ledger checked the door again. The slit hissed with blown sugar. "You hear that pitch change?" he asked. "She's taking water." 10 minutes. "We'll ride it out behind our little wall." He slid inside the corner and patted the spot next to him. The difference was immediate somewhere, between a garage in March and a church basement. Jack felt the shiver leave him by inches, like a landlord who'd decided there wasn't much furniture worth stealing here after all. The canvas above them ticked with snow grains. The train sighed. "You came out of Chicago," Ledger said. Not quite a question. "Yeah, job." Had one. Jack didn't recognize his own voice. It sounded blown out, like a horn that had taken on water. Ledger waited. The good teachers always do. "Bank clerk," Jack said finally. 29 stripped the gears. "Last week they called what's left of us in and said the only thing thinner than the ledger was our chances. I packed the rest of my pride in a suitcase, which turns out to be heavier than it looks." He swallowed. "Wasn't planning far, just away. Crash took my house," Ledger said Matt. "Kept my hands. I can build heat out of garbage and string. I call that a profit." He shifted, listening to the train with his bones again. "You got someone to write." Had. Margaret. Saying her name was like laying a hand on a stove you still don't believe is hot. She waited a while. Then she did the sensible thing sensible people are forced to do. Ledger nodded, like he and the country had both been through a divorce. "Out here," he said. "Sensible." "In your armor," Ledger said, tapping the newspaper just above Jack's heart. "You're a balloon full of tomorrow. Leaks kill tomorrow. Every half hour, listen with your skin. If you feel a thread of cold like a trickle down your back, it's telling you there's a new door you didn't build. Shut it." "How?" Ledger's hand was already in the pocket winter bag. He pulled a wisp of newspaper and a cloth strip, placed them in Jack's palm. "Practice now. Eyes closed. Tie in the dark. Find your knot by feel. Cold laughs at men who need lanterns. They practice slips and wraps, folds and fixes 'em till Jack's fingers, newly pink, could answer without asking. By the time they finished, you could feel the train's big inhale. Metal clanked somewhere up ahead. Chains took slack. The whole world leaned. "See," Ledger said. The belt. He blew out the candle stub and made the corner even smaller, pulling the canvas flap closer, leaving the thumb-sized vent near the top, cracked just enough to trade stale for safe. "We breathe right, and we outweight anything." They rode. Minutes or hours, it's hard to tell when time is measured in heartbeats and the small victories of not. Ledger told Jack where to hide if the car door slid and bull light found the floor. Wedge into the angle where the canvas shadow was darkest. Don't flinch. Don't cough. Become part of the car, not a passenger in it. He told him to count cars if they ever had to jump. 3 before is luck. The one you're in is life. The one after is pride. Don't reach for pride. "What about food?" Jack asked, throat scraping. The last thing he'd eaten was a heel of bread bought with a kitchen nickel. Ledger handed him something that looked like a mistake. A little paper packet, grease-stained, the size of a fist. Inside, cubed bacon, a rough nut meal, stiff as fudge, strips of dry meat so thin they were almost ragged. Chew slow. Breathe through it. Drink what little you've got, like it's a bank, loan small, frequent, paid back with patience. He tapped his own chest. I keep one flask here. Body heat keeps it honest. Jack chewed. The bacon, clean with smoke. The nut paste, dense with persistence. The jerky, a lesson in patience and jaw work. He felt the furnace kick, embers catching, flames settling into something that might pass for stamina. I thought riding the rails was for. He trailed off, ashamed of the word that had lived in his old bank brain. Ledger saved him. For men who had worse options, it is. For men who don't know anything, it is until they learn. You're learning, he appraised Jack the way old shop teachers measure cuts. Critically, and with a little secret pride when the student gets it right. You'll make it to morning on what you've got now. That was your first winter hour. Tomorrow we build a windbreak that can ride 60 miles an hour on a moving floor. After that, we talk about water that won't turn to glass. And after that, Ledger's eyes were quiet. In the matchlight, they looked like knotholes, dark and patient. After that, we keep a promise, he said. One Iowa boy who went looking for his father on these rails with a scar on his right cheek and more stubborn than any. January. Jack heard the sentence take the shape of a map between them. Before he could ask, the door seemed blazed white for a heartbeat. Somebody slid the car open a foot, sent a spear of night and snow into their corner, then slammed it again. The train didn't slow. The spear melted to nothing in their breathing. Ledger hadn't even turned his head. Lesson 2, he said softly. If the world tries to walk in, make it take off its boots first. The freight shouldered the dark. Somewhere very far away, a town dreamed of heat in pipes and breakfast. In the corner, 2 men listened to a boxcar sing about staying alive. Jack discovered that safety isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a pattern someone puts around you, paper over bone, cloth over paper, canvas over cloth, a human voice over fear. Ledger dozed with the economical sleep of men who trust their systems. Jack stayed awake longer than he meant to, fingers traveling his new armor for leaks, sealing tiny betrayals, learning by touch the difference between a seam that breathes and a seam that bleeds. When at last he slept, he dreamed of a furnace that had been fed, and of pockets that could hold weather and fold it to size. Outside, the cold kept doing what cold does. Inside, 2 strangers kept the tab even, and for the first time since he'd stepped onto a moving ladder and chosen the kind of life that didn't apologize for being hard. Jack believed morning had a reason to arrive. Asterisk by dawn, the boxcar had learned their names. That's what Jack decided when he woke to the woods slow popping. Like an old thing stretching, and the metal's colder creak, the way iron admits it's brittle and asks you to be gentle. Ledger was already propped on one elbow, counting something only he could hear. He did that a lot. Lesson count, decide. It was a math built from weather and timetables and muscle memory. More accurate than any clock Jack had ever wound at the bank. Feel your fingers, Ledger said. Before good morning, before still alive, because in the winter those phrases are synonyms. Jack flexed. Pins and needles ran their thorny relay. Then warmth shouldered in behind, like the second shift. Present and accounted for. Feet. They complain, which I take as a good sign. Ledger nodded. Dead things are quiet. He eased the canvas flap up with 2 fingers, just enough to let a slice of new day through. The light arrived blue, the honest color of real cold, not the pretty white that tricks you. The slit also carried in the story of wind. not yet howling, but purposeful, like a crew that had finished coffee and was heading to the job. We build, Ledger said. Car shakes harder at speed. Wind gets ideas about your heat. Our corner's a good start. Now we give it legs. Structure, Ledger said, already pulling the little world out of his oiled bag. A windbreak is only as smart as its bones. Where the first shelter had been speed married to instinct. This was a lesson plan. Ledger talked as he worked, not to brag but because the words helped him place pieces. He scavenged for narrow slats from the car's underlip. Some cars leave you gifts if you thank them, and laid them out on the floor like a carpenter auditioning constellations. He bound two into an L, then pinned the angle with a short crosspiece so the elbow wouldn't wobble under. Load, you set your frame into the car's frame, he said, tapping the corner post so you're not fighting the whole wind alone. This wood has survived more storms than we will. Borrow its ribs. He lashed the L to the corner post with figure-8 loops, knots that knew how to pull without cutting. Then he built another mirror L, and when he pinched them together, one, on each well you could see a shallow triangle being born, the kind of tent you could tuck your soul under. Canvas would go over that, but Ledger wanted more than warmth. He wanted silence, that flap yesterday. Bulls will hear flapping where they won't see smoke. He paused. Eye on Jack. Small fires are sometimes safer than loud canvas. He slid his palm over the fabric. So we stretch this drum. No tattling. They worked in tandem now. Jack held while Ledger tied. Ledger held while Jack learned to tie like the rope meant it. Knots have accents. Jack was picking up Ledger's. They hung the first sheet of canvas like a drummer setting a head, then stapled the inside with strips of blanket stitched end to end, leaving an air gap. Between the two layers, newspaper, of course greased into shingles, set in a fish scale pattern that would shed what little wind sneaked past the canvas. Jack had grown up in a world where insulation came in rolls with a price and a salesman. The rails taught him it also came in yesterday. The floor, Ledger said. Never forget the floor. He handed Jack an armful of cardboard harvested from a crate stamped. Corn syrup Peoria. Cold climbs, just like it falls. You let the metal touch your bones. It'll write its name on your marrow. They laid cardboard, then paper. Then a thin blanket Ledger had bartered for with a trick about unsticking frozen couplers. He ran the blanket 2 feet beyond where they'd sit. Thermal apron, he said. Keeps the cold from sneaking in under your guard. The wind upticked a half note. Beyond the slit of the door, the world blurred into fields, wearing white armor and fence posts hunched like old men. Ledger sniffed the air. 20 below by smell. 30 when she gusts. You can taste the iron. He offered the tin cup. Sipped the water, tucked all night against Jack's ribs, had stayed honest. He took the smallest drink he could, feeling the trickle hit furnace and turn to fuel. Now the trick most boys miss, Ledger said, flicking his knife toward a seam between the canvas and the car's wall. He rolled a strip of newspaper into a rope, then crushed it flat and tucked it into the seam. Edge gaskets. Wind loves corn. Quiet fire, Ledger said, smiling a little. And for the first time, Jack noticed how the man's face changed when he liked an idea. There's loud fire and there's polite fire. Loud fire is for bragging and camp pies. Polite fire is a glow you talk to like a friend. He produced a small tin shallow as a hand, sides crimped from some long ago can of Peach's End, a wad of tightly wound corrugate. He set the corrugated coil in the tin and dribbled a thumb's worth of bacon grease around it from a little corked vial. "Never throw fat away," he said. "Fat is winter money." He pulled the candle stub, touched match to wick to edge, and the coil took like a good listener. No flare, no fuss, only a low orange that confessed its heat softly. He slid the tin into a hollow he'd left in the corner. 3 bricks worth of old ballast stones, framing it to keep it from sliding. Above it he hung a pie plate by 2 wires, a crude baffle that spread and softened the small fire's language so it wouldn't tattle to the wind. "Polite fire," Jack said, grinning despite himself. "Doesn't brag." "Exactly." Ledger set the tin cup on the pie plate. The water hummed toward warm. "We don't boil. Boil breathes too loudly. We get her tepid and feed it to our furnace in sips." The car vibrated in a new way. A side-to-side snake instead of a straight-ahead hammer. Ledger felt it with his palm on the floorboard. "Curve ahead," he said. "Hold your wall," Jack braced. The canvas shivered, then rode the gust the way a sail knows to bend or tear. Ledger's knot spoke back to the strain. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you." When the curve eased, the whole shelter seemed to settle deeper into the car like an animal tucking its legs under, committed to staying. "You hear it?" Ledger asked. "What?" The quiet. He wasn't wrong. The first corner had dulled the cold. This second, this honest triangle with gaskets and manners, did something stranger. It edited winter's voice. You could still hear the rails and the wind and the periodic clank of a coupler announcing itself. But the cold's whisper had been turned down to a rumor. The shelter didn't just keep heat in, it kept fear out. Jack felt his shoulders drop a notch he hadn't noticed they were holding. Ledger poured 2 fingers worth of warm into the cup and passed it. "Everything we do is a trade. Warm for breath, silence for safety, time for learning. You make good trades, you live." They ate a little Ledger's bacon bits. The nut paste softened over the baffle, a sliver of hard cheese sliced thin enough to see light through. It was a breakfast built by verbs, not nouns. Slice, soften, sip. Jack's bank mind, which once counted assets in columns, began to count calories as prospects when they finished. Ledger slid the cup under his coat again, the metal cool against his paper armor. "Now we talk rain," he said, almost cheerfully. "Rain." Jack glanced at the door's slit. The day was a diamond. Rain seemed like a rumor from July. "Freezing rain," Ledger said, and the cheer in his voice was the sort a teacher gets when reaching the chapter that saves exams. The kind that coats the world in glass. Snow's honest you can see it, feel it, fight it. Freezing rain is a lawyer. It finds loopholes. It climbs ropes and sneaks into boots and turns wind into a sandblaster. You don't plan for it, you belong to it. What's the plan? "Double barriers," Ledger said. He checked the seams again with flat hands, smoothing tiny burrs, then tied a light canvas curtain inside the entrance to make a vestibule where snow or glass could be knocked off before it joined their private weather. He dug out a spare shirt and ripped it into narrow bands. "Face wraps," he said. "When the glass starts, you want layers you can swap without unwrapping your whole head. Wet outside comes off. Dry inside goes on." And boots, he looked at Jack's borrowed pair. "We stuff them with paper and keep a dry pair of socks in your hat. Heat rises. Let it do you a favor." The freight began to slow. Not the civilized break of a scheduled stop, this was the confused, uncertain deceleration of a beast meeting a problem it hadn't expected. Ledger lifted the flap an inch and peered down track. The wind brought a taste of ash. "Coal yard," he said, "or a town where coal dreams of moving. Bulls." "Maybe," Ledger said, "or a drifting. Storm last night, stacked snow where it shouldn't. Either way, rules don't change. We're smoke. We drift where no one looks twice." The car joggled. Shouts outside, small and far away. The shelter caught a gust and flexed. The polite fire leaned and kept its voice low. Ledger's hand found the corner post. "Count the steps to the door," he said, not panicked, just adding another item to the day's ledger. "From our corner to the slit, 7.5 of your feet now. From slit to ladder, 3 more. Say it. 7.5, then 3, Jack said. "Good, now eyes closed." "Say it again," Jack did, and his legs learned it from his mouth. A map folded small enough to hide in blood. They waited. Waiting, Jack was learning, was a muscle as real as calves and forearms. Ledger used it, well-checked seams. Taught a new knot. Made Jack practice repairing a tear, blind and cold, with the twine end between his teeth. He also talked short, useful pieces that added up to a code. "Rule 2, he said, is know your car. Rule 3 is know your neighbors. Other riders," Ledger said. "Most winters you'll have at least 2 within 5 cars. Some nights you're their luck. Some nights they're yours. We listen for coughs, for singing, for silence that feels wrong. You don't win winter alone." The wind shifted. A different cold slid its hand under the dormina, slicker. Ledger's head snapped up. "There," he said. "You feel that?" Jack did. The air had gone from powder to glass in one breath. Freezing rain. Ledger smiled that small, winter-pleased smile. "And the lawyer has arrived." He reached for the face wraps. "We'll need to check the vestibule every 20 minutes. Ice will try to freeze the flaps in place. We keep them honest. They set a rhythm." Every 20, Jack slid into the vestibule, knocked accumulating ice off the flaps with the flat of his hand, and ducked back in, replacing his outer faceband with a dry one each time. Ledger tended the polite fire and reset the baffle when the bass note of its heat got too eager. They drank in sips. They ate in commas, not periods. They talked about nothing and everything, the best way to tell wind. Direction in a black car. Listen to where the canvas tells the truth. How long to hold your breath when a bull's lantern sweeps the floor longer than your fear but shorter than your pride. What snow sounds like when it's jealous of rain quieter. "Why do you teach?" Jack asked at one point, surprised to hear his own question. "You could keep this to yourself." "Some do." Ledger cinched a knot and leaned back on his heels, thinking. "Because someone taught me when I didn't deserve the time," he said simply. "Because I've buried enough to know the ground is fed by secrets. Because the winter keeps a different ledger than banks do. I like balancing the account." They heard the plough before they saw. It the distant bullock's roar of engines pushing a V of steel through drifts like a ship parting a white sea. The car trembled. Snow hissed. Voices outside lifted in that relieved, post-problem tone men get when a bigger tool arrives. The freezing rain slackened to petty. The polite fire subsided to a glow that sounded like purring. Ledger checked the slit. "We'll move soon. Yard to yard, then the river country. Then, when we've learned enough to deserve it, St. Louis." He didn't look at Jack when he said the city's name. He said it like a gate he'd been meaning to walk through for a long time. "Got people there?" Jack asked, pretending to fuss with a seam he'd already fixed. Ledger's jaw worked once. "Maybe, my boy. Maybe only his shadow. I've chased both." He tied one last knot like a period. "Either way, we'll find what we can and keep the rest warm." The whistle blew 3 short birds. The car tugged, then leaned into motion, canvas humming. Gaskets doing quiet work, the vestibule ready to swallow glass and spit it back as water. Jack settled into the corner with the kind of confidence that doesn't brag, just the knowledge that they had made something smart together in a dumb world. As the freight took the grade and the wind tried on new voices, Ledger closed his eyes and recited the distances again. 7.5 steps to the slit, 3 to the ladder, 13 to the next car if they had to bridge the gap with fear in their mouth and rope round their waist. Jack repeated them after, their voices marking time. Outside, February practiced being cruel. Inside, 2 men rehearsed, staying alive until rehearsal turned into muscle and the muscle turned into calm. "Next lesson," Ledger said, not sleeping but pretending to. "Neighbors," Jack nodded. He looked at the vestibule, at the polite fire, at the canvas that had learned their breathing. He could do this. He could learn the country again with a different teacher. He could outwait a blizzard with newspaper and a man who carried weather in his pockets. The rails sang.
The first sign of neighbors wasn't a voice or a knock. It was a rhythm that didn't belong to the car. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps again, traveling through oak and iron like a message sent in bone. Ledger cocked his head. "Jungle code," he said, asking if anybody's breathing and friendly. Jack touched the wall with his fingertips. He could feel it more than hear it, like a heartbeat in the wood. "What's our answer?" Ledger took a short flat slat and rapped back 3 in 1. Friendly, armed with knowledge, not knives. The tapping from the next car over answered with a single grateful pop. Ledger smiled. "Hungry riders, maybe cold ones. We'll look in the next lull." "Lull?" "The wind'll change voice after the river bend," he said. "She gets tired of the same song. When she drops half a note, we move." They waited, counting sways the way sailors count waves to find the 7th. Jack kept his hands busy, checking the vestibule, patting the gaskets, practicing the blind repair knot until he could tie it with wet fingers and no curses. Ledger listened like a mechanic diagnosing a failing bearing through a wall. He cut the polite fire to a whisper and hung the empty cup under his coat again. Then the wind exhaled and forgot itself. The car relaxed into its rails. Ledger's voice went business flat. 7.5 to the slit, 3 to the ladder. "You go first. I'll tail rope you. If I tell you down, you drop and roll under the sill till I say up. Bulls at yards. Not likely between. Still, don't argue with rope." Jack tied the waist loop Ledger tossed him. He could taste steel already, a phantom flavor of fear that reminded him of chewing pennies as a kid. Ledger cracked the door just wide enough for a man to slip sideways. Cold-shouldered in, then paused at their vestibule, offended at the manners required of it. "Go," Ledger said. Jack slid out, careful, his paper armor whispering. The ladder rungs were knives. He led with his hands, then a boot, then the other boot, all of him leaning into the train's moving logic. The between space opened like a mouth, ballast stones skating past a foot below, couplers talking in their blunted vowels, and the thin dark clatter of the world saying, "Fall, and you'll be a rumor." The next car's grab iron waited a yard away. Jack put his left foot on the coupler plate, felt its grease try to negotiate with his balance, and decided to be rude. He heaved sideways, grabbed iron, and slid in through a door someone had left thumb-cracked against mercy. Ledger came behind in one clean movement that made Jack feel both safe and humble. The rope paid out with a friendly hiss and coiled without a knot's worth of complaint when Ledger peeled it. Inside, this boxcar was colder by 3 kinds. No corner shelter, just a heap of damp feed sacks in one corner, a broken chair used as a barricade against wind, and 2 men, boys really, wrapped in their own silence. One lifted his head, eyes wide the way stray dogs' eyes get when they haven't decided yet whether you are food, a hand or a stick. Ledger, the older of the two, said, stunned into a grin that pulled skin tight over cheekbones. You're real then. Real enough to nag, Ledger said, at ease now that there were people on the other end of his code. What's your name when you're not freezing? Red, the boy said, which fit. His hair was the color of a spent match. He thumped his friend's shoulder. This is Ducky. We got on at Peru. Thought we were smart. Turns out we were loud. Ducky tried to sit, saw the world tilt, and decided staying was better. His lips were the wrong color, blue shading toward gray, and his hands moved slow like sleepwalkers. Ledger's assessment took 6 seconds and 2 fingertips on Ducky's wrist. Hypotherm mid, he said to Jack. Furnace tired, but still paying its bills. We build them a corner. We feed the furnace. We teach. Then we go. While we work. Questions. Red blinked. Questions? We don't waste a crisis. Tell me what you thought you knew, Ledger said, already dragging the broken chair into a better angle. I'll salt the knowledge till it keeps. Red talked in bursts. The story of 2 farm boys who had read about riders and decided the rails were a dare you answered with a grin and one good jacket between you. The jacket had gotten wet during the midnight run from a siding to the train. We took turns with it, Red said, ashamed. Trading a thief back and forth, Ledger said. I'll let you beat up on yourselves later. Right now we fix the theft. They built fast. Jack's hands surprised him with how sure they were becoming, how the knot found the hole, how the paper learned to overlap without tearing, how his feet knew where to stand, so the car's sway turned helpful instead of hateful. Ledger tuned the canvas, thumbed the seam gaskets into truth, and talked the whole time. Air's the insulator. Water's the salesman. Don't buy what it's selling. If you sweat, you stop and pay attention because you just turned your heat into a thief inside the walls. Ducky made the small noise men make when heat returns to places that had been flirting with death. Ledger fed him a sugar pinch in a spoon of tepid water. Brain likes sugar when the colds robbed it. Not candy, smart sugar. Red watched with a focus that made Jack think of classrooms he'd once loved. We heard about newspaper, Red said. Didn't know it had. Rules. Everything good has rules, Ledger said. Paper's just bricks. Overlap is mortar. Cloth is the good neighbor who keeps you from feuding with the wind. They wrapped Ducky's core first. Torso. Armpits, groin, because Ledger said the heart is the furnace. The limbs just radiators you can afford to shut off for a while. Pinky fingers are prince, he said. It dies first if there's a coup. We keep the kingdom intact. The wind argued once. The car shook, and the broken chair creaked as if it had an old complaint to lodge. Ledger quieted both with a tug and a new knot. Ducky's color climbed a rung. Red's grin kept coming back like a bad habit he wanted to keep. Food, Ledger said, and Jack handed over a bacon cube and a nib of nut paste. Ducky chewed like a man at church, slow, reverent, grateful. Red surprised them with a produce store apple that had gone mealy but not frozen. Ledger cut it into thin shavings that melted on the tongue. Alchemy by knife. Then a whistle from far up track, 3 short, carried a different message. Yard ahead. Bulls. Ledger's head snapped toward the door. Time to have manners, he said. He taught the boys the bull rules in 30 seconds flat. No light. No sound. Canvas down. If I say down, you become bolts. If I say roll, you roll under the sill and kiss the floor. Bulls are hunters of motion. Jack's pulse learned to count backward. Yard lights smeared the door seam. Boots thumped the ballast like a marching argument. A lantern beam sliced the car, slid along the floorboards, and paused on the new canvas triangle. Jack did not breathe. Ducky didn't either, which told Jack Ledger had bought them that silence with his voice. The light moved on. The boots did too. Ledger didn't exhale for 3 long heartbeats after the last crunch. Then he smiled. Rail cops like easy stories. We don't give them a plot. Red laughed once softly, then clapped his own mouth at the noise. Ledger patted his shoulder. You'll learn when the world can afford your laughter. They pushed gifts into the boys' hands, spare strips. A folded pattern Ledger had drawn with a carpenter's pencil, half a packet of nut meal wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Eat like it's a conversation, not a shout, Ledger said. And check seams every half hour until you can't help it. Red's eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the kind of shine men get when someone hands them a tool they didn't know they needed. Ledger, he said, and the name was a blessing. If you see my brother on the line, what's he go by? Reed, Red said. Thinner than me. Scar on his... He touched his cheek, then laughed through his fear. Wrong side. Scar on the wrong side from the boy you're looking for. Ledger's face did that softening Jack had learned to watch for. We'll ask after him. The rails talk. We listen. Time to move. Ledger checked the wind, still the tired kind. He gestured. Jack grabbed iron. They bridged the between space again and slid into their own car's triangle as the yard opened in a web of tracks and lanterns and men who'd learned how to be winter angry for pay. Bulls at 2 o'clock. Ledger whispered, peeking. He was right. 2 shadows at the water tower, one laughing, one bored. Ledger had a map in his head and drew it now with his finger on the floor for Jack. We'll need to hop 3 cars up when we pull. That one has a door that lies about being shut. How do you... I look when I can, Ledger said simply. No more than the man who will try to stop you. That's the American art form. The train took water, coughed coal and jerked as the engineer ad-libbed his way out of a jam in the schedule. The bulls didn't bother to check their particular stretch again, either lazy or lucky, and the freight shouldered back into its eastward burden. Neighbors behind us too, Ledger said, nodding at the tap returning through the wall, 2 and 3 and 2. We'll look when the river's behind us. For now, you learn code. He taught Jack the 24 common knocks in the winter lexicon, the ask for food, 3, then a long drag of knuckles, the ask for water, 2 light, 1 heavy, the bull warning, fast 5, the thank you, 1 strong knock a minute after the help came, and the grief call, rap, 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 slow and hollow, that meant someone had died in the night and needed a kind of funeral only rails know how to give. You'll know it when you hear it, Ledger said. You'll hate knowing it. What's the code for help me but don't get yourself killed doing it? Jack asked. Ledger smiled without teeth. That's the knock we all hear all winter. Answer it if your calendar says you can. If it doesn't, you pay with more than fingers. The river arrived not as a sight but a sound. The way Big Water always announces itself. A low, steady hush under the car's metal talk, like the world shushing its own stories. The wind flatted. Ledger tapped back to the rear car, got the friendly answer and said, "Bridge work." Bridge work wasn't climbing. It was choreography. You moved car to car when the train's sway matched your step, made anger your partner, and refused to look down even when your feet wanted to count stones. Ledger tied the rope again, this time threading it through Jack's belt twice. "If you fall, I will drag you like a net," he said. "You will be mad at me for the bruises. Then you will be a man mad at someone while breathing, which is my favorite kind of man." They crossed. The rear car held a woman, didn't shock Jack by now. There were fewer rules out here than in the bank, and a kid with eyes like questions. The woman stood when she saw Ledger, posture ready to fight or learn. Ledger chose learn for both of them. He tuned their paper, showed the woman how to bind a mitten that could be swapped in seconds, and handed the kid the job of checking the vestibule flap every 15 minutes. "You keep us alive," he told the boy. "That's a man's work, which you are. What do they call you?" Jack asked the kid as he worked. "Mouse," the kid said proudly, small and fast, then not timid. He showed Jack a proud stash, 3 nails, a length of wire, 2 buttons, and a tin soldier with 1 leg that he said was lucky. "Legless means stubborn," Mouse explained. The woman's name was Nora, and she had the kind of face that looks pretty when it isn't trying. She wrapped the kid with paper like she'd been born in a quilt, then met Jack's eyes with a "Thank you, you don't say, because it's dangerous to owe too much in winter." Ledger left them a blueprint drawn on a sheet of the St. Paul Pioneer Press, complete with circles at stress points and little arrows showing the wind's usual crimes. "Bulls at the next big yard," Nora warned. 3 who like their work too much." "Thanks," Ledger said. "We'll take the alley route." Back in their own triangle, Jack felt longer in the arms and surer of his feet than he had any right to, given how recently he'd almost died of ignorance. Ledger noticed. "Don't let confidence outrun craft," he said mildly. "You're getting good. Winter loves that. It kills good men. It's bored with sloppy ones." "Message received," Jack said. He tightened his face wrap another half-inch like a penitent. They ran through drills until the sky learned noon. Ledger had a drill for everything. Drop and roll on a moving floor, one-handed knot with a dead hand, rewrapping an elbow when your fingers didn't want to play because they'd gone sullen with cold. He even had a drill for what to say when a bull had you by the collar. "Sir," Ledger said, is always the first word. Then you ask a question that makes him feel like a man who knows things. "Sir, is there a safer car I should be in?" He might point, he might not, but some part of him wants to be useful. You give that part your eyes. It shouldn't have worked. Jack suspected it worked more than it failed. Late afternoon brought sun so bright it made the snow into a mirror that tried to blind them. Ledger showed Jack how to squint through lashes and tilt his head so light hit brow instead of pupil. "Your face is a visor. Use it," he said. He also handed Jack a small stub of burned cork. "Smudge your cheekbones and the bridge of your nose. You'll look like a chimney sweep. You'll see like a fox." That was when the tap came, the grief call, slow and hollow, reverberating through both cars like a drum someone was too tired to beat. Ledger closed his eyes and bowed his head. "Rear of rear," he said quietly. "We go." They ran the rope. They bridged again, this time with the urgency that sadness gives, and slid into a car that smelled of old oats and winter breath. In the far corner, a body lay under a coat. 2 men stood helplessly nearby, hands empty, faces numb in ways the cold hadn't caused. Ledger knelt. He did what men do, checked what didn't need checking, because ritual is respect too. He pulled the coat back, looked once, then put it down again. "I know him," he said softly. "Name was Henry to me. Might have been something else to the war, and something else to a girl once." They wrapped Henry right, with dignity and the last dry newsprint. They tied his hands so he wouldn't fall open. Ledger took a carpenter's pencil from his pocket and wrote a note on a scrap. Just Henry, winter of 33, the boys on the UP, and a small, lopsided cross, then slid it under the twine so someone someday would know there'd been a name. He said a few words that weren't church, but were close enough to count. Jack watched and learned a different kind of code. The way you carry sorrow without letting it carry you overboard. They rode in silence after that, each busy with his own seams and his own ghosts. When the sun burned itself into a red coin and laid down in the trees, Ledger lit the polite fire for the night watch and taught Jack one more tap. 3 slow, Firm raps that meant, "We're still here." He sent it down the line. Red returned it. Nora returned it. Even the car with Henry answered somehow, the two men there maybe, saying, "We're here," and he was. Ledger closed his eyes and leaned his head against the corner post. "Rule 4, he said into the canvas, voice small and stubborn as the flame, "is that we look out for our neighbors, even when it costs. Rule 5 is that we live to do it again tomorrow." Jack repeated them, not to be a good student, but because he wanted them stuck in his bones. Outside, the rails stretched forward like lines in a ledger waiting for numbers, and the train wrote in them with steel. Inside, paper and rope and two stubborn men kept a different set of accounts, crediting heat and paying down fear. They slept in turns that night, and Jack's dreams traded the bank's silent marble for a triangle of canvas and the sound of 2 taps. Pause, 3 taps, pause, 2 taps again. The human morse of a winter country that had decided to remain humane anyway. He woke at his watch with the feeling a man gets when he knows the dark. And the dark knows him back, but agrees to a truce. "Next," Ledger said when Jack handed him the cup, "we learn how to eat 5 days from 1 day's food, and how to turn snow into water without turning yourself into snow." "Food and water," Jack said, pleased by the old language returning in a new key. "Assets and liquidity." Ledger cracked a smile in the half-light. "Now you're talking banker and hobo at the same time. That's a man Winter might respect." The train hummed. The polite fire purred. Somewhere down the line, a boy with a scar existed more like a promise than a person. Morning would be another lesson. For now, the neighbors were alive, the bulls were a rumor, and the ledger was balanced to the penny you can't spend, but still feel in your pocket all day. Morning cracked open like a cold egg. No clouds, no mercy, just sunlight knifing across a world made of glass. Every stalk of stubble wore a clear sleeve of ice. Fence wires had grown beards. Even the crows sounded brittle. The freight shouldered east, its wheels writing the same sentence over and over. Still moving, still moving, still moving. Ledger woke Jack with a gentle boot and a question that sounded like an order. "How hungry are you?" Jack considered. The honest answer was, very. The smart answer, he was learning, was hungry enough to be careful. "Hungry enough to be careful," he said. Ledger's grin was quick and satisfied. "Good. Today is calculus you can eat." He reached into the oiled bag and laid out the pantry like a magician prefers his tricks. Ordinary things, arranged just so. Bacon bits in a ragtide twist, nut meal in a folded newspaper cone sealed with candle wax, a tongue of dried beef thin as a bookmark, 2 hard lumps of sugar, a fist-sized heel of hard cheese tough enough to use as a hammer, 4 small metal flasks capped with cork and wrapped in cloth. "Rule 6, he said, "is that winter is arithmetic. You don't win by feasting, you win by turning small into steady." He pinched a bacon cube between his finger and thumb. "Fat first. Furnace likes logs, not kindling, when you're paying heat bills all day." He cut the bacon into slivers that looked like punctuation. "Eat fat in commas, not periods. Commas keep the sentence going." Jack chewed and felt the warmth arrive low. Not flashy the way a bank. Deposit feels nothing like a lottery ticket, but keeps the rent paid. "Protein." Next. Ledger handed him 2 shavings of the dried beef and told him to hold one between cheek and gum to soften while he chewed the other. "Chewing is work," Ledger said. "Don't make your furnace split wood and haul it the same minute." The nut meal came third, stirred with 2 thimblefuls of tepid water into a paste that looked like wool compound and tasted like a winter promise. Plain, oily, honest. Ledger thumbed a pinch of sugar across the top like a priest. "Sugar is a match. We use it for brain work, not panic. You eat it when hands are stupid and thinking feels like wading through syrup." Jack felt the match light behind his eyes. He hadn't realized how much of winter was a mental tax. "Cheese is for later," Ledger said. "We slice it so thin it's legally decorative." "Water," Jack said, eyeing the flasks. The sight of liquid made his mouth go eager and dumb. Liquidity, Ledger corrected because he couldn't resist the pun now that Jack had started talking in that old tongue. Rule 7. One big canteen is a stupid king. You carry a council. He lined the flasks like small stubborn senators. 4 little ones. 1 rides your ribs. 1 rides your thigh. 2 hide in the canvas pocket in the corner. We rotate every half hour. He held up a flask. Metal only. Rubber lies when it's cold. Cork because it forgives. Cloth wrap because it's a scarf for a bottle. He poured a thread of water into the tin cup and set it on the polite fire's pie plate. We don't chase boil. We chase not freeze. Hot drinks are a parade. Warm drinks are a rumor. Rumors are safer. Jack took a swallow. The tepid felt like kindness. Now, Ledger said, we make more water than we spend making it. He taught Jack the snowbaker's trick. Most people, Ledger said, stuffed fluffy snow into a pot and waited, cursing how it vanished to a teaspoon. Air, he said. Snow is mostly bragging. Instead, he pressed snow into hard balls the size of fists, then nested them in the tin in layers with a thumbnail's space between each. More surface area, less sass. He slid the tin close enough to the polite fire to warm, not scorch. As the lower layer turned to slush, he fed more snow down through the gaps. The slush swelled to liquid with a satisfying reluctance. Clean snow only, Ledger reminded, tapping his temple. Away from track, away from breaks, away from towns. Industry's a secret spice you don't want. What about eating snow? Jack asked, remembering a boyhood trick, mouth open under flakes, proud of catching a winter on his tongue. Ledger's head shake was firm. Emergency only. Snow is a loan with interest. Takes more heat to melt in your belly than it pays back. Better to melt with your wits than with your liver. They established the rhythm. Sip, press, stir, rotate flasks, check vestibule, repeat. Every 30 minutes, Ledger would slip a flask from his ribs to the corner pocket, pull a cold one into his coat, and pass Jack the third. Council meeting, he'd say. Warm seat, cold seat. No bottle gets to freeze in office. He showed Jack how to carry a pocket still, a small tin cup he tucked against his stomach under his paper. Body heat is free, he said. The trick is theft without complaint. In went a fist of compacted snow. 10 minutes later, Ledger fished out a spoonful of slush and trickled it into the flask. A man who can make an ounce an hour lives longer than the one who wants a gallon in 5. They ate again at what Ledger called the 10 o'clock dividend. 2 bacon commas, 1 sugar pinch without water, 1 translucent coin of cheese you could almost read through. Hunger lies, Ledger said as Jack stared at the tiny plate. It tells you to be a king for 5 minutes and a beggar for 5 days. We don't listen to liars. The freight slowed into a little town whose name Jack couldn't see because winter had erased the sign with a sheet of ice. A coal yard stood at attention, black mounds wearing helmets of white. 1 shack, 2 men, 1 dog. Ledger peered through the slit like a man reading a ledger's fine print. Yard steady, he said. No bulls yet. Might be a good stop for shopping. Shopping, Jack said carefully. He knew what the word meant here. He also knew the other words: stealing, scavenging, borrowing, surviving, midnight shopping, Ledger said. Rule 8. If you take, you pay. Not always in money, but you pay. He drew a quick map on the cardboard floor. Shack here. Warmth, coffee, eyes. Woodpile there. Promises. Scrap heap there. Gifts. We need slats and a new tin. Maybe 2 strips of canvas if the wind likes us. He touched his pocket. I've got 2 nails, a story about a stuck brake the man in the shack might not want to hear, and a hand for his coal chute. That's currency. When the freight clanked to a stop for water and coal, Ledger and Jack slid out and became smoke. The dog came near enough to sniff and decide they were weather. Ledger tipped his cap at the shack and the men inside made a gesture that could mean beautiful morning or my hands are open, and walked toward the coal chute without being asked. 10 minutes later, he had shoveled a half-yard of coal into the man's bin and admired the jammed hinge like a neighbor would. Sticks on a day like this, Ledger said, and suggested a trick with wire. It worked. The man grunted something that might have been thanks in a language wintermen used to save face. Ledger didn't wait for more. He let the man find a reason to hand over 2 scrap slats, a half-torn tarp. and a tin that had once held peaches and miracles. On the way back, Ledger paused by a fence post and scratched a little sign with his carpenter's knife. A slanted square with 2 lines and a dot. The Hobo code. Jack had seen chalked kittens and arrows in Chicago alleys, but never watched one born. Good for a meal if you work, Ledger said, translating. So the next man knows this post belongs to a decent human with a use for useful hands. Does the world deserve this much cooperation? Jack asked, equal parts moved and suspicious. No, Ledger said simply. We do it anyway. Back in the car, the cold had edged from insult to injury. The sun's glitter hid the fact that the air itself felt thinner. Jack's breath made small crystals on his scarf that crackled when he touched them. Ledger ran his finger across the canvas seam and frowned. Ice creep, he said. She's trying to glue us to death. They fought back with warmth and grease. Ledger rubbed bacon fat into the seam ropes and the canvas edge, making a lip that shed the freeze. Grease is a locksmith, he said. It picks Winter's pocket. He set the new tin on the baffle and made tea out of nothing. Handful of pine needles, a wish, a patient flame. It tasted like the inside of a clean barn and had the virtue of being warm and real. Vitamin C, Ledger announced dryly, as if he'd pulled a pharmacy out of a pocket. Prevents scurvy and boredom. A tap came through the wall, 2 light, 1 heavy. Water request. Jack felt the answering wait before Ledger knocked. 3 slow, patient raps that meant, we hear you, then the code for wait. Ledger filled a flask and tied it in a scrap of blanket to keep it from losing its temper on the way. Rope around his waist, Jack went with him across the coupler to Red and Ducky's car, hands tight, breath quiet. Ducky looked less like a rumor today. Red's grin was as permanent as his hair. Jack handed over the wrapped flask. The boys knocked the thank you, one good sound after it had time to be sincere, and Ledger taught them the snowbaker trick as payment for their gratitude. No free lunches, he said, and Red nodded, the kind of nod that says a boy is becoming a man because the world insists. On the way back, the car bridged a long trestle. Wind rose under them like an elevator. Jack's boots skidded an inch on a stripe of ice he hadn't seen. The rope snapped taut, and Ledger's hand was already on the collar of Jack's coat. Gravity reconsidered, and the world returned to its place. They said nothing. They breathed until the shakes stopped. Ledger patted the rope as if praising a good dog. Price of water is attention, he said when words could do work again. We pay it. Afternoon meant inventory. Ledger dumped the bag in the corners of canvas where they stashed small fortunes and counted like a banker who liked living more than numbers. Bacon, low but not alarming. Nut meal. Enough for 4 more days at the current sentence length. Beef, a page of a book. Cheese, a sunset. Sugar, 2 lumps that Ledger didn't look at when he counted because hope hates witnesses. Water. Enough, if they disciplined their throats. Jack offered his own inventory. The emergency bundles Sally had taught him to sew into his coat lining. He slit the stitches carefully, brought out the cloth packets like he was delivering babies, and laid them in a line. One of nut paste, one of raisins and crushed nuts, one of sugar and salt in a clever matchbox, one of dried apple chips so thin they were compliments. Ledger raised an eyebrow. Sally, he said, almost fond. Queen of winter kitchens, she said, to replace them if we eat them, Jack said, suddenly protective of the little hoard. Said emergency food isn't sacred, it's practical. Practical is sacred in winter, Ledger corrected gently. He put one bundle back in Jack's coat and tied 2 to strings high in the canvas corner. We eat one now. We hide one for when we are stupid and think we have none left. They split the nut and raisin bundle into fingernail portions and let them melt on their tongues like an expensive lie you tell yourself on purpose. Jack felt his brain smile. He didn't know brains could. Ledger taught one last trick before dusk, the grease lantern. He took a scrap of cloth, rolled it tight, tied one end with a scrap of wire, and set the tied end into a thimble of bacon fat in a bottle cap, balanced on 2 nails. He lit the free end with the candle stub, and blew softly until it learned manners. The flame that stood up was no show-off, but it made the canvas glow friendly. Ledger shaded it with the pie plate so it wouldn't gossip through the door crack. Polite light, he said. Same rules as fire. We never let pride be brighter than the need. They ate the evening's commas and warmed their flasks in the polite fire's breath. Through the slit they watched a farmhouse walk into dusk with a lamp in every window. On the fence post near the lane, Jack saw chalk marks, a smile half erased by weather. A cat's head. A stick figure with an open hand. Hobos welcome if you work, Ledger translated, almost pleased that the world sometimes agreed to be itself. A woman there who feeds the kind of men who show up with hat in hand and leave a chopped woodpile behind. Jack looked at the marks, at the yellow windows, at Ledger's careful ration on the floor. We won't, Ledger said, not unkindly. Not tonight. Bulls sweep after dark when someone's generous, and the rails need us smart more than they need us full. Tomorrow, if the wind permits, we'll trade a morning's labor for stew. Today we trade a lesson for sleep. He made Jack do one last circuit. Vestibule flaps, seam gaskets, baffle height, flask rotation, pocket still snow, polite lights wick, trimmed with a thumbnail. Then a new rule. Rule 9, Ledger said. You check your water the way a mother checks a fever. Every 2 hours you look at the color of your piss. Dark means debt. Pale means pay dirt. We don't be heroes about it. Heroes make poor corpses. Jack laughed once, surprised at the bluntness, and promised to be unheroic. They set watch. Ledger first, Jack second. The polite light threw quiet gold on the newspaper walls, making yesterday's headlines into today's insulation. In the half-sleep before his shift, Jack dreamed about a vault where people stored bacon grease and matches instead of bonds, and a teller who knew knots, and customers who thought interest meant staying interested in staying alive. He woke to Ledger's hand on his shoulder and the cup of tepid held to his lips like a communion. Outside, the glass world had gone blue again, and the wind had dropped to a tired whisper. The train beat its old sentence. Red knocked once, a neighborly hello. Somewhere behind them, Mouse tapped a careful rhythm that meant vestibule checked. Still breathing, still learning. Tomorrow, Ledger said as Jack settled on the watch crate. We play town. He nodded toward the chalk cat farmhouse, now a dark shape asleep in its own warmth. Hobo code, merchants with generous waste, the right door to knock on, and the wrong one to pass by. You'll see what kindness costs and how to pay it so it keeps. And after town, Jack asked. Ledger's eyes flicked east. Hannibal Yard. Bulls with long memories and short patience. We'll need new tricks. Maybe a friend who calls himself Emergency Eddie. Is he real? Jack asked, thinking of the stories like railroad ghosts. He's real when he's needed, Ledger said, which was not exactly an answer and exactly enough. He checked the rope, smoothed the seam, and sat with his back to the corner post, eyes open, breathing slow. A man who knew the arithmetic of winter and meant to keep counting until spring did the math for everyone. Jack watched the polite light draw quiet circles on canvas and thought, not for the first time, that survival was less drama than discipline, less heroics than the daily decision not to waste anything. Heat, food, water, time, neighbors, hope. The train hummed. The flasks warmed. The ledger balanced for one more night. Not because the world was fair, but because two men kept it that way on purpose. Outside, the ice glittered like money you couldn't spend. Inside, the furnace burned with bacon and stubbornness. Morning would bring stew and chalk marks and men in caps who'd rather swing a club than a shovel. Jack flexed his fingers, present and accounted for, and waited for dawn to open the store. Dawn came with a noise Jack hadn't heard in days. A rooster so sure of himself he didn't care it was January. The freight eased to a sidetrack and sighed, iron relaxing like a sore back against a chair. Ledger lifted the canvas flap and tasted the morning with his eyes closed. Town, he said. Small, honest, cold. They packed the corner shelter to walking. Tidy. Not gone, never gone, but cinched. Tight enough that a bull peeking in would see a stack of feed sacks and a tarped corner and decide there were lower apples. Ledger palmed a greased thumbprint across the canvas seam to dull any betraying shine. We'll be back before the cold forgets our footprints, he told the shelter. The way a man promises a dog he's just leaving to fetch a paper. They slipped from the car with the little rope between them. Habit, superstition, wisdom. Frost had turned the ballast into shattered glass. Across the gully, town wore its coat. Church spire buttoned to the throat. Grain elevator like a shoulder hunched against wind. A tidy grid of streets stitched together with snow and a sense that nothing new had happened there since the last World War ended. At the edge of the yard, Ledger stopped at a fence post. It already had a ghost of a sign, a chalk consonant left by a man who wasn't sure how much he wanted to say. Ledger took his carpenter's pencil and wrote in the language men had invented when letters got them into trouble. A circle with a dot, kind woman. An angled Y, religion nearby. 3 little hash marks, work for food, and a small, square frown, sheriff means business. He added a cat's head with its whiskers on. Hobos welcome here, but mind your whiskers. Jack felt the odd little lift of secret literacy. Feels like telling the truth quietly, he said. It is, Ledger replied, and tapped the frown once. And like most truth, it gets you in less trouble than talking loud. They followed the code toward a white house at the end of a lane lined with frozen laundry. Ledger tugged his cap lower and knocked in the manner taught by the winter fraternity. 3 light, 1 firm, 3 light again. A woman opened the door with her apron already in her hand, which told Jack more than any chalk could. Mid-40s, hair like clean rope, eyes like somebody's mom even if she never met you. Morning, Ledger said, hat in chest. We can split and stack a cord, mend a hinge, or fix a gate for a bowl of whatever the Lord is sending through your kitchen today. Gate, she said, businesslike, not unkind. Hinge, then the wood. I don't feed liars or men who think chores are poems. Ma'am, Ledger said, as if ma'am were a contract. Ledger, this is Jack. Call me Mrs. Pike, she said. And if the sheriff comes by, you boys were never here, because if you were here, he'd be wasting my time, and I have a stew to watch that doesn't stir itself. The gate leaned like a drunk. Ledger spoke to it as he straightened it, the murmur of a carpenter flattering a patient. Jack learned to love the sound of screws confessing and wood deciding to behave. They mended the hinge on the shed with Ledger's last good nail and a little bit of wire that looked like nothing and functioned like genius. Jack split wood like a man pleased to owe his lunch to physics. Mrs. Pike watched without pretending not to watch, the way people who have been hurt by winter in their own ways keep tabs on new variables. You boys from the yards? She asked over her shoulder. We're from everywhere, Ledger said simply. Everywhere never pays cash, she said. But there was no acid in it. When the chores became satisfying instead of endless, Mrs. Pike waved them in. Not to the kitchen, never the kitchen for strange men, but to a side porch where steam curled from 2 bowls the color of mercy, stew, potatoes, a piece of bacon that had made a long, slow journey from pig to miracle, a slab of bread that had met heat recently and wanted you to know it. Ledger bowed to it like it was a saint. They ate the way Ledger had taught, slow, grateful, measuring warmth by how far it traveled before it asked for more. Mrs. Pike leaned against the door jamb and regarded them as if they'd turned out about as she expected. Better, maybe. You ride in winter on purpose? She asked. Nobody rides in winter on purpose, Ledger said. We ride because winter didn't ask permission. Mrs. Pike nodded like she'd heard that sermon before. Sheriff's mean today, she said. Election year. He'll make examples where they are convenient. Ledger's eyes flicked to the chalk marks he'd drawn in his head. Appreciate the warning, he said. Will be smoke. She set a wrapped bundle on the porch rail and pretended not to see whether it got picked up. The bundle made a sound a man's throat understands without translation. Bread against paper. Odds and ends, she said to the sky. If they fell off the table, I wouldn't miss them because the Lord saw them go where they were needed. Ledger tucked the parcel into his coat without ceremony because he'd learned that thanks made certain generous people uncomfortable. He left something instead. A hinge pin reamed true, a gate that swung even, a woodpile stacked like geometry. He also put a chalk mark where she could find it if she wanted. Kind woman here. Share news of work. Husband at war. He left that one blank. Some chalk is too heavy to set. They were out of sight of the house when Jack finally said what he'd kept like a hot coal in his mouth. How do you decide who to ask? Ledger shrugged with his eyes, which was somehow more eloquent than shoulders. Some houses say no with their paint. Some say yes with their woodpile. I look for straight tools, not fancy ones. Porch swept. No beer bottles. Curtains that move when a rooster crows. And chalk, always the chalk. He pointed to a telephone pole near the crossing. On its tar-stained belly, a palimpsest of chalk told a novel. A warning about a bad dog. A cross for a doctor, 2 streets over who wouldn't ask questions. A double X that meant the last rider who knocked at number 14 got the door slammed hard enough to rattle his teeth. Jack read the hieroglyphs and felt less alone than he had since his first night in the boxcar. They swung by the merchant's alley next. 3 grocers, 2 butcher shops, a bakery and a hardware store, all breathing out into the same trash bins. Ledger's eyes did numbers like he was back at an adding machine. He peered into the grocer's bins. 1 too clean, swept before dawn. 1 hopeful, apple cores and cabbage leaves that still had opinions. 1 with yesterday's bruised fruit, tucked under paper like a secret. Ledger reached, rearranged, left coins of labor instead of currency, stacked crates, retied twine, a barrel lid back on straight. Dignity goes both ways, he said. We take what would die and promise not to shame the man it came from. The bakery yielded 2 heel ends and a paper cut from a sack that would become a fine seam gasket. The butcher's back step offered a sliver of sweet Ledger wrapped like jewelry. Grease lantern gets an endowment, he said. They saw the sheriff 3 blocks away before the sheriff saw them. A hat with an attitude and a coat that believed in nightsticks. Ledger edged them down an alley and over a fence like he'd just remembered he had an appointment elsewhere. They didn't run, they evaporated. Back at the yards, the freight huffed like it had won an argument with a bigger train. Ledger knocked Red's code. The boys answered. The woman Nora tapped the courteous neighbor hello. Even Mouse made his little rhythm, vestibule checked, seam good, eyes open. It sounded like a neighborhood. They settled in. Distributed Mrs. Pike's fallen bread, a slice to Red, a slice to Nora and Mouse, a slice for the corner pocket against the day the world got stupid, and warmed their flasks. Ledger took out the XX chalk warning from the pole and sat with it a quiet minute. We'll leave our own, he said, and scratched a quick mark in pencil on the inside of their car. One only a rider would notice. A tiny house with an honest gate and a square of bread. Next stop. Jack asked. Ledger's eyes went east, and even in the lemon winter light they took on shade. Hannibal, he said. Yard with more rules than a courthouse. Bulls who learn to run in boots and don't get winded. If the river's a teacher, Hannibal's a test. What changes? Everything and nothing, Ledger said. We still eat commas and stir snow, but we also get small. We become ordinary. We become parts of larger shadows. We use the line. You'll see. They rode the afternoon into a sky that learned gray. Fields gave way to bottoms, bottoms to sloughs, sloughs to the wide jaw of the Mississippi holding its breath under ice. As the freight curved, the wind stopped nagging and started whispering. Ledger's posture changed. So did the car's voice. Rails in big yards have a different music, higher in the bends, lower in the long straights, with a kind of city accent made by switches and crossovers, coats buttoned. Faces down, Ledger said. He took a length of cotton, rubbed a smear of soot across it from the polite fire's plate, and dabbed Jack's cheekbones and nose again. Light makes cops, dark makes neighbors. The yard opened a mile wide. Tracks braided and unbraided, switchmen standing on ladders gesturing in ballet, lights winking like stubborn stars. Ledger pointed with his eyes. There, he said. That catwalk across the coal bunker, that's the line. The line wasn't a literal rope. It was a conveyor belt, a slow groaning black river of coal chunks pouring up and over into bunker mouths. Men walked it with ease born of boredom, jackets open, caps back. No one watched them because the line always had men on it. We get on the line, Ledger said. We're nobody. We're background. How? We wait for a pause. Step in like you belong. Boots a little wide. Hips a little careful. You look where you're going and nowhere else. If a bull barks, you make his job his pride. Sir, where do you want this coal? He'll point and you'll go that way until you cannot go that way anymore. Jack's stomach did a small gymnastics routine. He trusted Ledger's logic the way a man trusts bridge work now. He didn't love it. The freight slowed to a painful crawl. Bulls were specimens, one tall and happy, one short and mean, one with a notebook, the most dangerous kind. Ledger watched their orbits and picked a seam between them like a running back finding daylight. Now, Ledger whispered. They slid from the car, cut behind a string of tankers, and stepped up onto the line as if they'd clocked in. Coal moved under their boots with the surly compliance of a beast that would rather be a mountain. Jack bent, grabbed a shovel because everyone else had a shovel, and fed the slow mouth of a hopper that wasn't theirs for exactly 6 seconds. A bull passed 10 feet away, head turned toward a switchman arguing with a brakeman. Ledger's pace never changed, never wavered, never apologized. They crossed the length of the bunker, climbed down a ladder like it belonged to their day, and slid between two loaded cars to the relative quiet of a cut headed toward the eastbound departure tracks. Ledger breathed once, a controlled leak, and smiled with half his mouth. "You stole a yard's worth of invisibility," Jack whispered, half giddy, half sick. "We borrowed it with an interest rate of humility," Ledger said, and in another minute they were swallowed by a boxcar whose door hadn't quite taken its own advice. Inside, hay chaff, the sweet smell of what had once been summer, and three men at the far end who looked up, judged, and decided not to be surprised. One of them had a face built by wind, jaw like a plow, nose that had met a lesson or two. He wore his coat wrong in exactly the right way, collar half up, scarf knotted in a sailor's square, sleeves greased dark to mid-forearm. His eyes took Ledger in like a foreman inventorying tools. "Ledger," the man said, and his voice put stories into a single word. "You owe me a cigarette from Omaha." "I owe you an apology for not having one," Ledger said, grinning for real now. He turned to Jack. "Eddie, meet the bank that winter didn't close." "Emergency, Eddie?" Jack asked, trying not to sound like a boy meeting a legend. "In emergencies, I answer," Eddie said, which was the kind of humility that has decided bragging wastes oxygen. "You look undead, which is good." "Heading where?" "East," Ledger said. "St. Louis when the line decides to be generous." Eddie nodded. "Then you're on the wrong car. This cut's headed to a stockyard spur first. Bulls love a puzzle with hooves. You want the grain line 3 over. We can get you there when the hump riders go to lunch." "Hump riders?" Jack asked. Ledger winked. "Men who ride the rail crest and kick cars onto the right tracks with their boots. Yard ballet. Lunch is their intermission." Eddie patted the hay and made them sit. He spoke in quick chalk, which tracks were traps, which switchman owed him favors, which bull was breaking in a rookie and was therefore loud, which crossing had a slat loose you could lift to pour yourself through. He carried a small kit, that was the only word for it, wrapped in oilcloth. Needles, heavy thread, a bottle of iodine, a roll of bandage, a metal spoon shaped like it had once lived in a battlefield tent. "You see frostnip before it writes its name in ink," he said. "You say it out loud. You don't man through it. You speak it, and we fix it." Jack watched the way Ledger and Eddie liked each other, like two old dogs meeting noses and deciding to share a bone instead of arguing over it. The way Eddie's eyes rested on seams and wrists, and the pale strip where Jack's scarf had slid. He reached without asking, tugged the scarf up, nodded. "Lave throat," he said, as if confirming a line in a ledger. When the yard horn blew, one long, two short, Eddie stood. "That's our lunch," he said. "We move when men move to their sandwiches. You step where I step. You hold your shovel like a man walking to work. You look like you've got a name and are too busy to share it." They did exactly that, stitching through Hannibal's long metal intestines like needles that had learned which fabric to pierce. Twice, bulls passed close enough Jack could smell winter on their coats. Twice, Eddie made himself into background, nodding to a brakeman, handing a wrench to a man who didn't know he'd dropped it, pausing to look at a dumb gauge with a smart face. They slid into the grain line like a thought nobody wanted to say out loud and shut the door with a whisper. Jack leaned against the wood, warm compared to the outside, and let his lungs have an opinion. Ledger rested his head for a moment, just a moment, against the corner post as if praying to the god of almost and not quite. Eddie eased down onto a hay bale. "You boys know the mantra?" he asked. Ledger smiled. "Which one?" "The one that gets you through yards," Eddie said, raising a finger with each word. "Small, simple, steady, silent, useful." "Useful?" Jack asked. Eddie's grin was quick and feral. Men in uniforms like useful things. "B1." He glanced at Jack's hands. "You banked?" he asked, not as an accusation, but like a doctor taking a history. "Guilty," Jack said. "Good," Eddie replied. "Banks understand schedules, and yards are just schedules with louder shoes. You'll live." They shared Mrs. Pike's last 2 slices of bread with a ceremony that would have embarrassed them if anyone had named it. Ledger passed Eddie a heel of cheese the size of an apology, and they sawed it into confetti and made it matter. The freight jerked, then settled into a new rhythm with a longer stride. Eastbound at last. Eddie dug out his iodine and a needle, fixed a torn seam on a man in the corner whose paper had lost the argument with a nail, and hummed an old march under his breath. He looked up only once to add, almost as an afterthought, "Storm coming by morning. The kind that thinks it's funny to start as rain. Be ready to change your mind twice." Ledger's eyes went flinty at the word rain. "Ice on paper," he said softly, disgusted. "We'll need your tricks." "You'll get them," Eddie said. "Tonight we sleep. Tomorrow we invent." The train crossed the last of Hannibal's yard with a muttered complaint and threw itself across the river on iron teeth that clung to stone. Jack heard the Mississippi again under the wheel rhythm, the steady hush of a serious thing not impressed by weather or men or depression or plans. He looked at Ledger and Eddie and felt, for the first time, like their corner shelter had grown legs and walked into a city and back out again without anyone noticing. Small, simple, steady, silent, useful, Jack repeated, more to himself than anyone. "Write it on your bones," Eddie said. "Winter will try to erase it. Don't let it." Night came quick. The polite fire grew to a whisper in the grain car's corner. They drank warm, not hot water, ate commas, salted the seams with bacon fat, rotated the council of flasks, and laid down in the pattern Winter had taught 3 men who meant to see spring. A triangle of heat with trust as the 4th side. Outside, the river kept its counsel. Inside, the chalk marks they carried in their heads glowed soft and true. The cat on the fence post, the frown on the sheriff, the circle and dot where Stu had waited. Tomorrow would bring rain that wanted to be glass, and paper that wanted to be stone, and tricks that wanted to be invented. For tonight, Hannibal was behind them, and the ledger of the day closed with more credits than debits, which is all anyone could ask when the country itself was overdrawn. Sometime after midnight, the roof began to ping. Not the soft sift Jack had grown to know, the felted hush of honest snow, but a meaner music. Thin, high strikes like a pocketful of nails tossed on a drum. The air inside the grain car changed first. A damp that snuck in on tiptoe and put its cold hands on the back of Jack's neck. Eddie was already awake, sitting cross-legged with the oilcloth kit open, as if the weather had written him a letter. Ledger's eyes found Jack's in the minimal light, and without standing, he said, "The sky just turned slippery." Outside, the wind shifted from scolding to whispering. The ping grew to a patter, then a rake of beaded sound, and when Eddie slid the door an inch, no more than an inch, a curtain of sleet hissed across the gap and froze there into a filigree. "Rain that wants to be glass," Eddie said. "Rule 10, paper wins against air, loses against water. Today we teach it different." They moved like men who had rehearsed a play separately and were now discovering it was the same one. Ledger hauled the oiled canvas from the bag. Eddie unrolled a spool of butcher's twine. Jack warmed bacon fat and the last of Mrs. Pike's sweet in the tin until it became a clear, convincing sheen. "First principle," Eddie said, his voice the calm of a teacher who knows the lab might explode, but intends for it not to. "Moisture management. We keep the weather out, and the furnace from making its own storm. Vent low, vent tiny, vent true." Ledger nodded toward the vestibule they'd built, a shallow porch within the car, canvas doubled and angled so that air had to ask permission twice before it could bother them. "We'll add a drip lip," he said, already folding the new tin's rim into a crescent and wiring it above the slit so melt would fall away from seams instead of down them. Jack brushed warm fat along stitched lines, felt it vanish into cloth and come back as reluctance. Water's new enemy. Second principle, Eddie continued, knotting the twine into a cat's cradle that became guy lines before Jack had a word for it. Suspension. If a cover touches a cold wall, it becomes that wall. We float our roof. They threaded twine through grain car slats, tied small smart knots that could be pulled with numb fingers, and lifted the canvas like a sail inside a cave. An air gap appeared, a thin, precious nothing that would become everything. The sleet hissed on the car's steel, and the canvas answered with silence. Third principle, Ledger said, grinning despite the hour, because engineering always made him happy. Sacrificial layer. He held up a newspaper and tore it into scalloped strips. We borrow the hair of a seal we don't have. Strips went over the outer canvas like shingles, each overlapped by a thumb's width, each rubbed with the warmed sweet until the paper darkened and shone. It looked ridiculous, a roof of yesterday's news and bacon perfume, and within minutes the pellets striking it began to slide and fall, pattering harmlessly onto the baffle plate beneath. Jack worked the sweet with a cloth like a man polishing a saint. He could feel it, the difference between damp that sneaks and wet that insists. These shingles did not become heavy. They became sly, water-beaded and fled. Fourth principle, Eddie added, tapping the tin measuring cup they called the still. Recovery. Melt happens. We catch it before it becomes regret. He wired shallow pans under points where drips would gather, little gutters that fed into their council flasks. Let the storm pay part of our water bill. The polite fire had to be taught new manners. They raised the baffle higher, narrowed the pit, and shaded flame with the pie plate so steam would stroke the canvas rather than slap it. Eddie adjusted a vent seam low to the floor, the smallest unkindness to the weather that he could manage while keeping carbon monoxide a rumor, not a headline. Coats off, Ledger said unexpectedly. Jack blinked. We're already damp, Ledger said, pointing to Jack's shoulders where a glitter had started. Not ice, but sweat threatening to choose a side. Rule 11. Take heat where it belongs. If you cook in your coat, you freeze in your skin. They stripped to their paper layer and wool shirts, wrapped their coats around heated stones from near the fire, field stones Ledger had scrounged from the ballast days ago and kept like pets, and let the warmth chase moisture outward. When they slid coats back on, the inside of each held a small summer. The door hissed under a new load of sleet. A rhythm began. Tap, slide, patter, repeat. The car itself felt heavier, a boat collecting an armor it hadn't asked for. The wheels sang in a higher register, a violin forced to carry a tuba. Eddie lifted his head. Switches will freeze, he said. We may stall on a siding while a man with a hammer becomes important. Then we'll use the time, Ledger said. We'll teach Jack the ice wrap. Eddie grinned. Hideous but true. They showed him how to wrap paper around limbs with an extra inner layer of cloth that would accept sweat and an outer layer that forgave it. How to fold a micro-drip edge at the wrists and ankles. A tiny gutter that told meltwater to leave politely. How to build a double collar at the neck that acted like a lock in a canal, admitting breath but declining rain. Change your mind twice, Eddie said, tightening Jack's elbow wrap and then loosening it by exactly 1 degree. You'll think tighter is warmer. It is until your blood stops voting. Then it's treason. All winter is paradox. You want airtight shelter that breathes, dry heat that doesn't crack, movement that rests you. You change your mind twice on purpose so the weather doesn't change it for you. The freight stride shortened. The whistle blew a long complaint, then a practical trio, crew talk for we are slowing on purpose so as not to meet God by accident. Through the slit they saw the yards glow, a siding lamp with a halo made of ice. 2 men in coats moved along a switch like priests tending a stubborn altar. One swung a hammer, the other poured sand and salt that tried to remember it was once ocean. A knock then, tight, desperate, too fast. Ledger was at the door immediately. Eddie moved to the fire like it might need convincing to behave. Jack slid the canvas flap enough to see a face. A kid. 19 maybe, eyelashes white with ice. A scarf so wet it might as well have been a dare. "Please," the kid said, because sometimes there is only the most useful word in the language. Ledger pulled him in. Eddie stripped him without shame or ceremony, a nurse in a battlefield with no time for modesty. The boy's shirt made a sound like paper dying when it came off. Jack had him by the shoulders, Ledger by the hips, and in 2 minutes the boy was a parcel of newspaper and cloth with a breath inside. "Name?" Eddie asked, working the warm stones into the bundle's small armpits and groin and wrapping his feet like delicate facts. "Billy," the boy said through chattering teeth. "Hannibal, I slipped, lost my pack." "We'll find you a new one," Ledger said, in the tone of a man who has fixed worse. Billy's eyes climbed the rope of his fear to something like curiosity. "You Ledger?" "That's what I've been called." A flicker of relief. "My brother said to find you if I got wetter than sense." "Your brother has a type," Eddie muttered. And Jack nearly laughed while holding a stranger's shivering elbow in a fist of paper and care. When Billy's shivers passed from violent to persuasive, Eddie gave him thimble sips of warm water with a pinch of sugar dissolved. Ledger slid a heel of bread under his lip and said, "Don't chew. Just remember." The car jolted as the switch remembered how. The cut rolled forward, found the main, and took a breath. Sleet kept writing like a stubborn student. The sacrificial shingles shed it. The drip lips paid their taxes, and the pans ticked with drops that mattered. "Inventory," Ledger said softly, as if counting were prayer. They were good on water now, better than good. The storm was paying back. Fat supply low, but Eddie produced a surprise, a thumb of axle grease in a paper twist. "For canvas seams, not mouths," he said, catching Jack's raised brow. "Though I've seen worse cooked on toast by men who didn't intend to die prettily." "Canvas first," Ledger agreed. They rubbed the seam where the sacrificial paper met the baffle. The grease became a weatherproof signature. "Next trip to a yard," Eddie said, "we'll go hunting for paraffin. Soap too. Kendall ends. Old-timer in Duluth taught me to boil paraffin, shred soap, and make a nasty salve that turns canvas into a bad decision for water." "Duluth sounds like a man trying to make the weather apologize," Jack said. "He did," Eddie replied. "Weather declined." Billy watched them with that intensity only people recently saved can muster, as if memorizing your hands were a form of thanks. "I was under the coal bunker," he whispered. "Thought I could outrun the line. Rain started. The line got slick. He stopped the sentence because they all knew the verb. "Lines are only good when everyone on them agrees," Ledger said, not unkind. "Today they don't." "We'll get you layered right," Eddie said, "and we'll build you a pack out of the things the world thought it didn't need." They did. Ledger folded a feed sack into a knapsack with twine straps and 2 slat stiffeners. Jack cut a strip of canvas into a roll top that would cheat the rain. Eddie tucked inside a tiny parcel, 3 paper shingles, 4 cloth wraps, a grease twist, and a note written in pencil on the back of a timetable. "Vent small. Change your mind twice. Don't run on the line." Billy held the pack like a certificate. The train's rhythm evened. The sleet softened to rain for 5 traitorous minutes, and then found its faith again and returned to glass. Their roof whispered. The drip pans clicked contentedly. The still warmed the new harvest of water. "Food," Ledger said, and they ate the commas. The winter arithmetic that never became romantic, and yet, in the allergic light of an ice storm, felt like the richest meal Jack had ever had because it meant the next one was probable. Eddie taught one last trick before dawn, skate socks. He pulled 2 rags from nowhere and slid them between the boy's paper and his outer socks, then dusted the soles with a whisper of sand from a ballast bag and tied a cord around the arch. Friction where you need it, slide where you don't, he said. On ice, control is the only luxury. They set watches again, shorter now, because sleep in an ice storm is a loan you repay with interest. Jack took second, a window that let him listen to the sleet turn the world into a glass museum, and then, sometimes, mercifully, into silence. He looked at the roof they had built from bacon and conviction, at Billy sleeping with his breath running blue and regular, at Ledger and Eddie sitting with their backs to opposite posts like bookends someone had put there on purpose. What's the cost of changing your mind twice? Jack asked into the near dark when Eddie returned from checking the pans. Only pride, Eddie said, and the men who do winter well never had much use for that. He crouched, adjusted the drip lip with a surgeon's touch and added, tomorrow will be sun. That's the punchline. Everything we just did will turn to brittle. We'll ungrease, unshingle, open vents, chase damp with light, and thank the sky for offering 2 different problems in 24 hours. Ledger smiled without opening his eyes. Then St. Louis, he murmured. Iron Mike's bluff, and a telegram that might make a woman in California cry in a good way. Billy stirred. Iron Mike real? He asked, thick with sleep. As sidewalks, Eddie said, and twice as helpful. The car rocked over a bridge, and the river below spoke in a lower voice, ice plates slurring against pilings. Jack thought of Mrs. Pike's chalk, of the sheriff's hat, of the coal line they'd strode like ghosts, of the way water paid them back because they made it. He thought of paradoxes that kept men alive, roofs that breathe, coats you heat without fire, fires that don't show, neighbors made of strangers, and a country that was broken and somehow still full of people mending things anyway. Morning pried its way into the car as a bluish certainty. The sleet thinned to a spit, the spit to a fog, and then the glass began to fail, sheets sloughing from the roof in slaps that sounded like applause. Cue the sun, Eddie said, stretching his shoulders. Time to change our minds. They unhooked the sacrificial shingles. Some saved, some surrendered. Ledger rolled the sweat cloth and tucked it away like money. Jack wiped seams so they wouldn't harden into bitterness. Eddie opened the low vent a finger's breadth wider and raised the corner of the canvas roof to invite a little honest light. Steam rose from coats, from ropes, from the very floorboards. Billy stood under the new sun and put a hand on the pack they'd made him, as if weighing it against leaving. I can pay you back, he said, which always sounds like a promise and sometimes is. You will, Ledger said. Not to us, to the next kid who knocks. The train's stride lengthened. Ice fell away in sheets and shattered into diamonds along the right-of-way. The world looked like a jewelry store with no customers. Inside, 4 men sat in a corner shelter that had learned 3 new tricks overnight. And Jack felt like he'd been promoted not in a bank, but in a fraternity that knew the password for another day. St. Louis by evening if the line behaves, Eddie said. Iron Mike's bluff has a stove that draws like a preacher. You'll like it. He glanced at Ledger. Telegram first. Ledger nodded once, the way a man does when hope and a plan shake hands. Jack checked the pans one last time and poured captured storm into a flask that had spent the night against his ribs. It felt warm like currency tendered and accepted. He capped it and grinned at the simple miracle. A glass rain that had tried to kill them had watered their morning. Change your mind twice, he said, trying the words on his tongue, and live to change it again, Eddie finished, as the car rolled east into a day that would try and fail, to be ordinary. By late afternoon, the car's breathing had changed again. City rails have a different heartbeat, tighter, impatient, the way crowd footsteps on a station stair learn to share a rhythm or everyone falls. Outside, the light turned the color of a penny rubbed, thin. St. Louis rose from river vapor like a steel-backed story you only half believed until the letters on the grain elevators spelled it, whether you wanted them to or not. Eddie stood, rolled his shoulders, and looked out through the courtesy slit. We'll jump at the coal bin southeast of the bridge, he said. Bulls do laps like parade horses, but the bluff paths between their thoughts. Ledger, you still know the cut up to the sycamore? Ledger's smile was small and satisfied. I could walk it blind with 2 left boots. Let's not, Jack said, only half joking. Billy touched the straps of his feed-sack pack like a man shakes hands with himself. The boy had learned to set his scarf just right, the ledger of his breath showing only as a tidy fog. Somewhere between Hannibal and here, he'd acquired the posture of a rider, shoulders ready but not tight, eyes doing arithmetic without blurting the answer. The train consented to slow. Yard bells clanged. A slab of river flashed through the gap, like a coin flipped by a giant who wasn't taking bets. Ledger counted. 2, 3, now. They dropped to cinders that crunched like burnt sugar and ran crouched along a fence so bearded with old vines it might have been asleep. Eddie led them through a hole that looked too small until it wasn't. And up a slope where the city pretended to keep dirt only, because it didn't know where else to store. The bluff greeted them with its winter face. Bare-limbed trees doing calligraphy against a hard sky. Ledges like eyebrows over stone mouths. Footpaths announced themselves the way thoroughfares do when you've trained your eyes to read absence. The way snow packed differently, the way dead leaves had been brushed where no wind could reach. At a sycamore with scars like a boxer's good stories, Eddie paused and whistled 3 notes a meadowlark would have recognized if it had applied to the Union. A reply came from under the earth, 2 notes and a laugh that meant it. A head appeared from behind a boulder, beard rhymed with frost. Cap square as a carpenter's truth, eyes that owned the ground they surveyed. "State your miracle," the man said. "Iron Mike," Eddie answered, and it wasn't deference so much as a handshake you could hear. "Brought good paper and a telegram to write." Iron Mike's grin came on slow and then contributed heat. "Ledger," he said, and clapped the carpenter's shoulder with a thud that sounded like wood meeting wood. "You owe me a story. I owe you a stove grate," Ledger replied. "And it's in my bag if the world wants to be decent today." "Decency owes us rent," Mike said. "Come in before the river decides to brag." He led them through a cut between rocks, then down a slanted slot barely shoulder wide. The air changed, warmer by a margin that mattered, with a smell of earth that remembered spring. Dark gave way to order, a chamber carved honest by water, then corrected by human hands. Stone ribs arched overhead. Walls wore patchwork. Planks, canvas, overlapping tin, all arranged with the argument, "No drafts where we didn't invite them." The jaw of the bluff had been taught to close and open in all the right places. Passageways branched like fingers. Everywhere there was evidence of deliberate thinking, a trench along the back wall carrying melt to a covered sump. Shelves built from found lumber holding items with respect instead of desperation. Vents near the roof cut into stone and faced with adjustable tin louvers. Chimneys that looked like ideas that had won votes. The stove sat proud in the main chamber like a preacher who knew his text. Pot-bellied, shoulders patched with riveted steel, a stovepipe that ran not straight up but sideways first, then up, then back again in a set of baffles that would wring heat from smoke like a miser wringing coins. A small ladder climbed to a clean-out door halfway to the louver. Beside it, a bucket of sand, a coil of wire, a candle, a piece of mirror. "Welcome to the bluff," Mike said, spreading a big hand to include the obvious and the invisible. Rule 1, we breathe on purpose. Rule 2, if you make a fire, you watch it like it owes you money. Rule 3, if the river fog rolls in and changes the draft, you change the stove before it changes you. He pointed to a chart chalked on the rock, a little engineering catechism in pictures. Damper positions for fair weather, for fog, for east wind, for snow, and for the rare clear, cruel night when the sky turned to glass and the draft went greedy. Beside the chart, a simple candle test drawn by a man who never assumed. If the flame leaned the wrong way, you opened this and closed that. If it fluttered like a bird at a window, you did the opposite. "Stoves kill stupid," Mike said without gloat. We declined to be that. Men drifted from side tunnels like fragments forming a sentence. 3 older riders with careful fingers, a minister's son who'd traded hymns for rail schedules, a farmhand with a cough that made the wolves listen. A thin man in wire glasses stood and nodded to Eddie with the economy of professionals. "Dr. Carl," Jack said under his breath, the camp surgeon they'd heard about back in Junction City. "Just Carl here," the doctor said, hearing anyway. "Titles don't make sutures, hands do." Mike got them sorted with the operational ease of a foreman who loved his men more than his systems, but knew the systems kept the men alive. Bed down in Chamber C, no drafts, modest snoring. Food after the stove settles. He plucked the grate from Ledger's bag and held it like a relic. "You are the stubbornest man I know," he said, and the gratitude underneath the insult warmed the room 2 degrees. Ledger knelt by the stove as if at an altar you could improve. He set the grate, shimmed a leg, tightened a seam with wire, and left a tiny gift, an ash door latch fashioned from a hinge pin and Greta's last good nail. He looked happy in the way men look when their hands are saying exactly what. Near dawn, the bluff woke differently. Feet ran a little. Voices learned edges. The stove's draft changed from preacher to drunk uncle. Eddie was up before the second footstep and Ledger by the third. Iron Mike met them halfway to the main chamber with his jaw set. "Carbon flirt," he said. "No drama, maximum truth. Fog came in off the river at 2 and tried to teach us new physics. Louver's stuck on B-side. Candle test caught it before the cough did. We're opening C and D, shutting 8.5, raising the secondary baffle. We keep them breathing." They moved like violinists following a conductor, chords tugged, dampers set. Doors cracked exactly as much as the chalk said. Dr. Carl stood over 2 men with pink coming back to their lips. Jack watched Iron Mike hold the mirror near a sleeping man's mouth, catch fog on glass, nod once. He saw the candle flame lean where it ought and be scolded where it didn't. He saw a community adjust itself like a unit, not a mob. "Do you see?" Eddie whispered to Jack when the room exhaled. "This is what a system is for. Not to boss a man, to keep him." Footsteps on the bluff stairs turned into a boy with ink on his fingers and legs that could have outrun regret. "Telegram!" he panted, waving the envelope like an absolution. Ledger took it with hands that had been steady when everything else shook. He didn't open it right away. He looked at Eddie, at Jack, at Iron Mike, at the stove that had decided to draw properly again. Then he tore the top clean and read. His face did a dozen things in one breath. He closed his eyes and opened them again in the same second. And when he spoke, his voice had salt on it. "She says," he began, and then had to stop and swallow because tears are just water you make on purpose when the world offers ice. "She says to Pete, my boys, I knew you were alive. Come home when the road says yes. The workshop is the same. So am I. Love, Alice." Iron Mike slapped his back. Eddie grinned with all his teeth. Billy whooped like a kid who had just been told winter had an off switch. Jack found he was laughing and didn't remember deciding to. Ledger read it again because some words improve at second glance. He folded it tiny and slid it into the inside pocket where a man keeps his living. Then he went to the chalk chart and, with Iron Mike's attention, adjusted a damper 1 degree. "First we keep the stove," he said, wiping his eyes with a knuckle and smiling like a man who had been granted both past and future in the same envelope. "Then we plan the road west." Outside, the river shrugged and the city coughed, and Winter considered what trouble to offer next. Inside the bluff, a stove drew like a preacher with a full house, and the air tasted exactly like something men had learned to own. The telegram changed the air even more than the stove did.
Heat can make a man drowsy.
Hope makes him exact. Ledger moved like a carpenter, measuring twice even when the wood had already agreed. Eddie's eyes learned a second horizon. Jack felt the road west unroll inside him like a ribbon of track no one else could see. And Billy began to practice not dying with a zeal that bordered on cheerful. Leaving a good hole is harder than finding one, Iron Mike said at breakfast, pouring coffee like a benediction. Rule 4, take what you know with you. Leave what you built for the next man. And Rule 5, never head out on a Friday unless you plan to fight your luck all the way to Sunday. He glanced at the calendar carved into the chalk wall. It's Wednesday. The world is offering you a decent exit. Ledger had already begun inventorying the real freight, knowledge. He led Jack and Billy to a slate slab polished by 100 sleeves and drew a route with a carpenter's pencil stub so short it lived under his fingernail. Maine to Jeff City, then Pacific, Rolla, Springfield, Joplin if the southern line behaves. Otherwise cut north after Cuba and pick up the Missouri Pacific westbound, he said. We hug the low country in winter and the lee of warehouses when we can. We avoid yards that hire bulls who drink for sport. Eddie added weather to the map, not with symbols but with stories. Fog sits in this bend like a sleeping dog when the river's warm, he said, pointing near the yards. You change draft and gate both, or you'll give yourself away coughing and clattering. He tapped a mountain pass further west with a finger that had learned snow in a dozen dialects. And here, this is the place where the wind practices to be Kansas. A good shelter fails in 2 minutes if you set the seam to leeward. Remember that. Let the world push your seams shut, not open. Billy repeated the phrase under his breath. Let the world push your seams shut, as if it were a password. They spent the morning in iron, Mike's school disguised as chores. Dr. Carl showed Jack how to notice infections before they had the courtesy to turn. Red warmth where there shouldn't be any. A smell like pennies. Eddie drilled Billy on vent cords with his eyes closed. Left 2, right 1, count to 6. Listen. Ledger taught knots that never forgot they were supposed to come loose. Bowlines he could tie in the dark around a wrist that was running out of circulation. Truckers' hitches that held a top like promises. Iron Mike ran them through bridge protocol, which sounded like a sermon because a fall is a kind of judgment. Rule 1 on bridges, Mike said, holding a length of hemp rope the way a man holds an argument. You do not trust your eyes. Trust your hands. Trust your feet. Trust the man ahead of you whose hands and feet you are tied to if you're wise. When the ties are glazed, you shuffle. When the guard timbers shine, you keep your center low and your prayer high. When you see water, you do not think of drownings you've heard about. You think that water is exactly not where I am, and you keep it that way. Ledger added a carpenter's footnote. In sleet or fresh snow, tap each tie with your toe before you step. If the note is hollow, it's rot. If it sings, it holds. The river will ask you to hurry. You decline politely. They tuned their packs like instruments. Iron Mike handed Jack a soot-blackened tin, an ember can with a twist lid and air-pin holes punched by a nail. Fire travels, he said, but we don't show it to the rails. You bank a coal, feed it with char, keep it on a short leash. No smoke, no smell if you carry it right. Saves you 10 matches over 10. Days and keeps your hope warm in your pocket. Sally was not in, St. Louis. The bluff had a way of making legends feel next door even when they were 3 states over, but her handwriting was. On a shelf were 4 little packets marked with her brisk letters: grease, candles, sugar, salt. Iron Mike pressed 2 into Ledger's hand and tucked 1 into Jack's coat without looking like he was doing anything fancy. Food is physics, he said, but flavor is morale. Men don't freeze so fast when their tongues think life is still worth tasting. They would have left by noon if not for the matter of the theft. It came in small, the way trouble does in camps that are determined to be better than the world outside. The minister's son, Jeb, a boy whose hands had learned to chop wood without complaining, couldn't find his tin of bacon. Bacon is not merely food in winter. It is medicine, currency, a promise. He had stowed it in a cubby under the shelf, wrapped in a flour sack, knotted double. Someone had seen and needed. Iron Mike's camp did not do lynchings or lectures for pleasure. It did a thing they called Riders' Court. Everyone in a circle. A handful of rules enforced by the kind of shame that doesn't smell of theater. Jeb's bacon walked, Mike said simply, standing where the stove could hear and approve. If the man who borrowed it without asking brings it back now, we will talk interest instead of sentences. Silence beat its wings twice and sat. The cougher coughed. The stove ticked. Billy shifted. Jack felt heat rise in the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the stove. He knew what hunger could make a man do and what pride could stop him from undoing. From the smallest side tunnel, a shadow separated. A wiry man with a hat that had once been respectable and now wasn't clutched a flour sack like a prayer book. He set it on the floor like an apology that had to pass inspection. "I took it," he said, voice flat with the lack of a better choice. "Hungry makes dumb. I thought I'd make it to morning. I didn't. I ate 2 pieces and hated them right to the last chew." Iron Mike's eyes were the kind that count and forgive in the same breath if they can. "Name? Caleb. Story? Lost a partner last week. Lost my knife yesterday. Lost my manners last night." Dr. Carl looked at the man's hands as if hunger writes in bones. Eddie watched the room, not the thief. Ledger watched Jeb. Jack found himself hating the absolutes that Winter tried to enforce. "Here is the math," Iron Mike said quietly, as if teaching a child who has made an honest mess. "We don't keep men alive with bacon and then kill them with shame. The debt is 2 tins back for the one, paid in kind or in work. Till then you eat with us under an eye and you don't walk near the pantry alone." Jeb's jaw had set in a way that would have become a lifeline or a ledge, depending on which word he picked next. He looked at the sack, then at Caleb's hands, then at the stove because it was easier. "He returns what's left," the boy said. "He works my wood shift 2 days. He learns to wrap paper with me, and if he learns quick, I'll forget by spring." Iron Mike nodded. Sentence passed, lesson learned. "Done," he said. "We will not eat each other here. The world does enough of that above ground." Eddie's mouth twitched. "Rule 6, never make an enemy you can teach," he murmured to Jack. "Rule 7, never make a friend who can't take a rule." The moment passed like a splinter coming free. It hurt, then it healed, because someone worked at it with clean hands. By early afternoon, the bluff had given them all it could. Ledger stood at the tunnel mouth with his pack square, a spare set of paper and cloth in the oiled bag, the ember can clipped inside, the telegram pressed flat against his ribs. Eddie adjusted his scarf so the knot would not become an ice coin under his jaw. Jack checked the mirror and matches. Billy touched his new knife, Eddie's old one reshaped on Mike's stone, and promised himself he'd use it for rope before anything worse. Iron Mike shook Ledger's hand with 2 hands. "Telegram boy runs past every day at 6, he said. "If Alice sends a reply with a date, I'll wire ahead to Junction City, North Platte, Cheyenne, wherever you fall into a hole. We keep the road talking to itself." They climbed out into a light that had decided to be honest. No fog, no sleet, just cold as a rule written in stone. The city's breath came up from the river and tried to tell them the stories it told every man, danger and deals and the taste of bread you didn't pay for. Eddie cut through alleys that smelled like yesterday's soup and bad decisions, and led them to the southeast freight approach where a line of boxcars waited like dogs watching a door. "Bulls will walk this string," Eddie said. "We shadow them. We are holes in the fence, not flags waving." They moved in 2-man bounds along the line. Ledger counted doors partly open, 2, 10, 12. He timed his breathing to the pat of a patrolman's stick on a boot. Billy learned the art of looking like you belong to air. Jack felt his body move the way a story moves when it knows the next chapter is already typeset. The jump was easy, almost kind. The car they chose smelled of lumber and ambition, empty except for a few slats and a number chalked on the wall by a bored brakeman. Eddie slid the door 2 inches shut of safe, counted the light and began the ritual. Corner shelter, baffle vent, paper out of oilcloth, cloth cinched with that toothsome balance between circulation and confidence. Westbound, Ledger said, setting his pack where it would not turn into a projectile. We buy the miles slow today and fast tomorrow. He smiled without planning to. We are going home. The first hour out of St. Louis always feels like a man trying to remember a song. The rails clacked cautious. The city's edge refused to admit it was ending. Then the river fell behind and the land inhaled, and the car began to sway like a promise relaxing its shoulders. They made speed until the bridge. It ambushed them the way bridges do when you're new to a line. The subtle slow, the different tone under the wheels, the width of the sky in the slit. Eddie's head went sideways, listening, and Ledger's chin lifted, scenting at the same time. Steel, Ledger said. Old, slick. Bridge protocol, Eddie said, and the phrase changed the temperature inside the car. They were out the door into a wind that didn't care for names. Sleet hadn't returned, but the night's glass still filmed the walkway, a skin of mischief you'd only notice by falling. The guard timbers shone like polished lies. Below, the river pretended to sit still but moved with the certainty of a factory line. They clipped a short safety line between belts. Not to drag each other down, Eddie said. To find each other if stupid happens. Ledger led, tapping ties with his toe. Thwick, good. Thwack, hollow, skip. Thwick. Jack followed, hips low, hands on the timber like a man greeting a stranger politely. Billy came third, eyes too big and not big enough, repeating, "Let the world push your seams shut," like a spell. Halfway, the wind played a trick it had rehearsed for years. It fell silent. Quiet on a bridge is a lie. It unanchors your ears. Billy's foot went where his head said it ought instead of where Ledger's tapping said it should, and his heel slipped. Not a fall, not yet, just a drop of weight moving wrong. The rope went tight between them, a man's width of physics. Eddie's hand was on the rail in that same second, grip that had learned where rust ends and steel begins, and Ledger's knee dropped, center of gravity doing fast math. Jack did the unglamorous thing right. He sat. He sat like he meant it, all his weight into the walkway, making a human anchor out of fear. Billy grunted and cussed and then laughed, because the laugh cuts the panic cord. "I had him," he said shakily. "You did not," Eddie said without heat. "We had you. That's the point." They finished the crossing in a quiet that wasn't silence this time. It was the sound of men doing exactly what the rules required and liking the outcome. On the far bank, Ledger knelt and thumped the boy's shoulder twice, once to settle him, once to settle himself. Back inside, breath turned to fog like good ghosts. Jack's hands shook in the way that tells you you're still alive and soon won't. Eddie handed him the ember can and a joke. "Carry the sun for a minute," he said. "It likes your pocket." They rolled west into a sunset that had decided to look like a bruise healing, purple with light at the edges. Jack drew a small square on the wooden wall with a carpenter's pencil. A bridge, a rope, 3 dots. Not a boast, a record. Ledger nodded at it like a man nods to a tally he'll be glad to see come spring. Night grew, and with it the cold that had been building its case invisible all afternoon. Eddie set the watch. 2 hours each, he said. "Bridge luck makes men cocky. We answer with discipline." Jack took the second watch. The car creaked and hummed and smelled of pine and sweet and something like resolve. He listened to Ledger's sleep, quiet. Nothing a doctor would worry over, and Billy's messier, still learning, and Eddie's, which was not sleeping so much as a temporary truce with the need for it. In the dark shape of the slit, the world flickered. A farmhouse window, a mile of white field, a copse of trees doing semaphore in the wind. Jack put a hand on the ember can in his pocket and felt the tiny warmth, the little voice saying we're still here. He touched through his coat, the folded telegram against Ledger's ribs, and thought of a woman in California who had written love always like a thing that couldn't be bargained down. He found himself saying Iron Mike's rule out loud, quiet, so the stove in the bluff couldn't hear and feel betrayed. Take what you know with you. Leave what you built for the next man. They had taken knots, cords, charts, a stove's moods, the idea that shame could be currency if you knew how to spend it. They had left. Grates, a latch, a steadier draft, and the promise to return word down the line. Maps in your bones now, Eddie said from the dark without opening his eyes. That's how you don't get lost when the paper blows away. Jack smiled into the black. What about when hope blows away? Eddie rolled to face him, features a rumor, voice sure. That's why we wire it to a woman in Sacramento. That's why we cut bacon small and grease our seams and teach boys to laugh on bridges. Hope's not a weather. It's a practice. The train drummed its agreement in quarter notes. Out beyond the slit, the country went on being itself. Fields learning how to sleep, towns counting their mistakes, rivers arguing softly with their banks. Inside the car, 4 men rehearsed getting to spring. A carpenter whose letter had bought them all a new season. A medic who believed in charts and choices. A banker learning the currency of heat. And a boy with a pack made from a feed sack, and a future that didn't need a label yet. They kept their watch. They breathed on purpose. And somewhere ahead, where the map dipped and rose like the chest of a man settling, the road west waited patient as a good stove, hungry for stories and ready to draw if you learned its damper. Dawn came thin as paper and twice as brittle. The car had found its stride, rails ticking like a wristwatch that wanted to be a drum. Ledger woke by degrees as carpenters do, first the hands, then the eyes, then the mind that already had a list. He checked the ember can, breathed into the slit, tilted his head like a man listening to a wall for studs. We're past Pacific, he said. Smell the limestone in the cut. We'll see Cuba before noon, if the line doesn't get uppity. Billy rubbed sleep out of his hair with his cap and grinned. Cuba, Missouri, he said. A town named for a warm place. That's cheating. Eddie dug in the oiled bag and flipped out a strip of bacon like a magician who respected his audience. Names are what folks wish for, he said. Cold country keeps hot names around to feel brave. They were breaking off coin-sized pieces of Sally's grease candy, sugar, fat, salt, a ration that lit the back of your brain, when the air changed. Not the temperature, the smell. A burnt bitter note snuck under the door, thin at first and then insistent. Ledger sat up fast. Hot box, he said, already moving. Jack felt the word fall into him with the thud of a new rule. He knew enough about trains now to know that danger came fast and stupid. Axle bearings heating until grease turned traitor. Then smoke, then spark, then fire, then maybe a jumped rail. Inside a wooden car in winter, you don't wait to settle debates about physics. They slid the door 2 hands wide, took the cold like a slap, and looked down along the wheels while the world whipped past in white and brown blur. The smell got louder. Eddie leaned, caught a glimpse of orange where no color should live, and his voice went flat with authority. Back 2 cars, he shouted. Starboard journals cooking. Protocol, Ledger said, and the word was a rope. Eddie grabbed the red bandana from his pocket, a flag when you needed one, and Jack had the lantern lit at the second match. They worked the door wider. Eddie knelt and swung the lantern low, arm out into the winter like he was trying to hail the ground. A code as old as brakeman. Up and down for hotbox, wide circles for trouble ahead, long swings for emergency. At first the wind ate their message. Then the caboose whistle barked twice, the answer of a man who'd read the same book, and the train began to ease like a stubborn horse hearing its name. A brakeman in an overcoat ran along the top with the hopeless grace of men who do jobs that shouldn't be possible. He dropped at the ladder 2 cars back, vanished below the sill, and came up coughing a string of words that would have peeled paint if winter hadn't already done it. They stopped in a country the map called Between. Snow drifted in the lee of small hills. Fence posts counting distance like the beads of a stingy rosary. The brakeman's face was a wind-chapped map of gratitude and grief. Good eyes, he told Eddie, or good nose. He spat black and lifted his cap at Ledger, a bull for the old ways. You riders saved us a wreck. Staves loose? Ledger asked, crouching. Worse. The brakeman jabbed a thumb at the bearing box where smoke bled like ink into cold air. Packing went dry. grease like gravel. Some yard hand shoved it out without checking. He offered the use of a name. "I'm Hank," he said. "Don't make me say thanks more than once. It'll ruin my reputation." They got to it. Hank broke the seal on the journal box. Steam burped out like a small demon leaving home. And under the iron cap lay the guts of the wheel's patience. Waste packing baked to ash, brass running out of apologies. Eddie fetched the water bucket from inside their car. Jack went for snow, because water runs off where snow will sit and cool. Hank shook a can that had once been labeled oil and now answered only to its smell, almost empty. Ledger reached into his coat and brought out a twist of rags, the cleanest he could live without. He stuffed them around the axle the way a man bundles a baby against a wind, and Hank packed snow over the rags while Eddie drizzled the last of the oil into the bearing's throat like a last kind word. "We nurse it to Steelville and beg a shop," Hank said. "We go slow, we pray neat." "Won't hold otherwise," Ledger agreed. "Tie a mark." Hank chalked a big X on the car side. "Railroad for this one's a sinner." He looked at Jack's lantern and grinned. "We teach new boys out here now?" he asked. Jack shrugged. "New boys teach us not to get lazy," Eddie said. He saw the smell. They rolled on under a promise. "That's another thing about winter. It teaches machines to keep their word or die trying." The axle complained at every turn, but they got to Steelville, where a little yard did its best impression of a big one, and a shopman with a moustache that could have shoveled snow pulled the brasses with a curse and a whistle combined. Eddie slipped Hank a twist of Sally's grease candy without ceremony. Hank slipped Eddie the locations of 3 good water towers between here and Springfield. Men trade what they can. At the water stop, Jack saw his first full book of chalk. Hobo signs on the backside of a signal house, in a hand language older than the ink of the mission's ledger. A cat for kind woman, a cross for mission, a top hat for boss man gives, scratched over with a circle for not lately. A triangle of 3 lines meant safe camp, and a curlicue like a question. Mark with a tail meant cops with sticks. Billy stared like a boy in a library. Ledger traced one symbol with a finger. "This one," he said, "means work for food here, honest pay. Remember where it is." That note goes stale slow. Below the chalk, someone had carved a date with a nail. Jan 4. Someone else had added, "Cold as the sins of St. Louis," and drawn a stove with a crooked smile. On the jam, in a neat rectangle, a tidy hand had written S, followed by a small lightning bolt. Sally, passing through weeks ago, leaving weather and food marks like a breadcrumb trail nobody but the right people could eat. They found a jungle outside Cuba tucked into a line of cottonwoods, a place where the snow lay thinner because men had taught the wind manners. The camp was small, winter-tight, nothing like Iron Mike's cathedral. But careful in the same way, fires dug low, smoke scrubbed through brush. Shelters oriented so seams faced friendship instead of mischief. A woman in a patched coat tended a pot the size of a hotel's opinions, fish bones rattling a music of their own. She eyed them without apology, and then, seeing Ledger and the way he carried himself, nodded once. "Stove man," she said. "Not man. Not man's apprentice," Ledger said, tilting his head at Jack. "Soup woman," she said back, and a smile tried on her mouth and found it fit. Her name was Marion, and the jungle called her Mare, a word that meant strength and stubborn, and a joke that wasn't a joke about hauling half the camp through a storm last winter by sheer will. "We've got cough, 2 toes turning theatrical, and a boy who thinks whiskey is a food group," she told them in triage shorthand. Dr. Carl would have loved her. Eddie nodded and split the work as if the orders had arrived inside his skull by telegraph. They taught while they patched. Ledger showed Mare's crew a baffle fashioned from stovepipe elbows and common sense that stole heat twice before smoke got out. Jack added a tin mirror above the main vent with the candle test scratched underneath. Billy taught kids how to wrap paper without making mummies. The smallest girl called him Professor Newspaper, with the reverence children reserve for men who can make warmth from trash. Mare's stew had the tired nobility of river fish and the bright courage of salt. She set them up with bowls and the kind of bread missions throw away when it looks like yesterday and tastes like peace. When Eddie thanked her in that gruff way of his, she shrugged. We pass it, she said. Either you send it forward, or winter keeps it. At dusk, a man limped into camp with the elaborate nonchalance of the newly hurt. Rolled my ankle on a frozen rut, he said, trying to make it sound like weather. Ledger's eye went straight to the swell. He and Jack packed a snow wrap. 10 minutes on, 5 minutes off. The rhythm of a man who intended to walk tomorrow. Eddie made the man a brace from a crate slat and a belt that had seen better bellies. Mare watched, measured them with the kitchen's smart eyes, and nodded small. You boys don't just survive, she said. You maintain. After supper, men gathered around the lowest, hottest fire and talked the way winter men do. Sentences that looked like tools, stories that double as maps. Hank had a cousin in Springfield who ran a second-shift switch crew. They were shy of an extra pair of hands on clear nights. Mare knew which mission door didn't creak when you stepped through after hours. The father inside pretended to be blind 6 nights a week and a cop on Sundays. An old violin appeared and someone played something like church for a minute that made the snow forget its job. Billy fell asleep sitting up, head tilting against the side of the shelter, mouth open in a way that reminded Ledger of another boy. In another time he could smell like sawdust. Before dawn, Ledger walked alone to where the trees held the wind for him. Winter's silence has layers. He listened through 3. He took Alice's telegram out, creased enough to be a map on its own, and read it again, because kindness reads well in any light. He folded it small and put it back under the rib the train had not needed yet. He wasn't alone when he returned. A man was waiting at the edge of the firelight, careful the way hungry men learn to be. He wore a soldier's coat that hadn't done him the courtesy of bringing the war's warmth with it, and boots that had been other men's feet first. He carried himself like he'd learned to ask permission from doors before going through. Need something? Ledger asked, gentle, like he was talking to a wild dog that might be a saint. The man lifted a hand. Name's Cole, he said. Folks said there's a Ledger here. Stoveman, carpenter, boy named Thomas with him. He had the kind of face that holds onto its lines on purpose, the way some men collect scars because they mean they weren't cowards. Ledger felt his eyes go narrow and his heart do arithmetic. There is, he said. And you're either a telegram in boots or a problem with a polite voice. Cole laughed once, a bark he had to remember how to do. Telegram, he said. From St. Louis. Iron Mike sent me. Said if I found you, I should say, the river owes us nothing, and you'd know he didn't send a liar. Eddie appeared beside Ledger the way Eddie does, out of shadow with warmth like a pocket stove. Jack came up behind with his hand open, not empty. Mare watched from the stew pot with a ladle that could have been a weapon if anyone asked rudely. Cole reached into his coat and brought out a folded envelope that had done some miles. Ledger took it and stood very still while the world moved anyway. He recognized the tidy script that had told him love always without asking for a bargain. He opened it so carefully you could have sworn it might bruise. The words were simple, as the best ones are, and they arranged the future without pretending to own it. Pete, if you can reach Cheyenne by the thaw, I can come to meet you with a neighbor's truck and money saved from the cannery. Thomas, if you are with your father, mind him and forgive him at the same time. Jack, whoever you are, thank you for carrying pieces of my boys when they were too heavy. Weather says 2 more hard snaps before March. Don't fight the sky. Build for it. Alice Ledger read it twice so he could keep his hands from doing something that would make Mare tease him forever. He handed it to Eddie, who read without moving his lips, and then to Jack, who felt his chest swell with a thing that didn't have to be his to make him taller. Billy woke with the pure timing of the young and looked around with eyes that reported everything at once. Good news? He asked, voice full of Hope's accent. Ledger smiled, the smile of a man whose map now had a town circled in red. A road, he said, with a person at the end of it. They left Mare's camp at first light with a different stride. Winter wasn't done with them. That wasn't how winter behaves. But the line west had a signal now glowing steady in the mine's distance. Eddie marked a Hobo sign on the cottonwood with chalk. A triangle for safe camp, a circle for work, a little arrow pointing at Mare's stew with the letter M for remember. Springfield next, he said as they walked back to the right-of-way, the snow squeaking like it was trying not to. Then the long open where the wind stops learning and starts teaching. Ledger touched the letter like a man touches a talisman and slid it back under his rib. "Hot box is behind us," he said. "Bridges practiced. Food plan solid. When the sky turns to iron, we do what iron men do. We flex instead of breaking." Jack felt the rails hum come up through his boots like a story unpaused. He thought of Iron Mike's candle by the flue, of Mare's ladle, of Hank's chalk X on a sinner car, of the language of signs that let desperate strangers behave like family from 30 feet away. He thought of Alice in Sacramento measuring her winter in cans and hope and a neighbor's truck, and of a place called Cheyenne that now sounded like the single syllable for home. They threw themselves inside a westbound with doors that remembered how to be kind. The car had a draft the size of a letter slot and a floor that sloped just enough to make a man crab-footed. Eddie smiled. "Teaches vigilance," he said. "Luxuries rot the senses. This car will keep us honest." Jack set the lantern in its niche without lighting it. He ran his hand along the wall where men had written their names in the faded ink of pocket knives. He added nothing. Some stories don't need scratching. They need doing. As Missouri unrolled toward a blue distance that promised the high plains, wind tested their edges and found them tight. Ledger tapped the wall once like a man taps a beam he trusts. "Boys," he said, not looking away from the slit and the country flickering through it. "Welcome to the part where winter stops being a place and starts being a personality. Shake its hand, keep your hat on, and don't laugh at its jokes." The car laughed for them, a wooden chuckle that turned into a hymn when the rails hit a perfect stretch. Somewhere ahead, the land got bigger and the sky got closer. Somewhere ahead, the road would ask the last of what they had to give before it owed them spring. They shifted their packs closer, tightened their layers, and leaned into west like men who had finally learned its grammar. Missouri unspooled in rows. Timber, field, town, and the low blue hint of Ozark shoulders. The car hummed that steady prayer a man can keep pace with, and winter showed its next trick, light so bright it bit. The sky was a sheet of hammered tin. The snow threw it back twice as hard. "Snow blindness country," Eddie said, squinting through the slit. "Sun doesn't just warm. Sometimes it steals." He reached for the soot pot Iron Mike had tucked in their kit, a coffee tin with char at the bottom, and thumbed black across Jack's cheeks, then Billy's. "Soot cuts glare. Sillier you look, safer your eyes." Ledger tore a length of muslin into narrow bands, pricked 2 slim eye slits with his awl, and passed them around. "Soot glasses," he said. "They make you look like a bandit and keep you from walking off a trestle like a fool." They tied them on. The world narrowed and sharpened at once. Billy grinned, just teeth between cloth and scarf. "I feel like a hero in a dime novel," he said. "Heroes lose toes," Ledger answered, not unkind. "Builders keep them." By late morning the line lifted and sang. They were climbing toward Rolla, where rails learned to bend and men learned patience. The wind came crossways, busy as a gossip, worming through seams, testing knots for weak stories. Ledger checked the shelter and liked what he saw. Seams presenting their backsides to the gale. Vent cord set to a whisper, floor blanket dry as pride. He touched the ember can, the coal inside still muttering its private sermon, and tapped Billy's elbow. "Your inspection," he said. "Find me 2 improvements." The boy crawled the corner like a cat on union wages. Serious, slow. "This lash point could use a half wrap," he said finally, and the paper cuff at the door gapes fraying. "We could stitch it with wire, not string. String drinks wet." Eddie's mouth tugged at the corner, his version of applause. Jack handed over a scrap of baling wire like a medal. "Practice makes a rider. Praise makes him careful." They slid through a cut that smelled like damp rock and coal breath, then out into a valley where Rolla showed its hat, water tower, spares yard, a mission with a cross that had seen more winter than anyone had a right to. Somewhere beyond, the Frisco line chose its loyalties, south toward Springfield, west toward a web that would eventually knit to Kansas City and beyond to the Union Pacific. Springfield tonight. If the Bulls don't make theater, Eddie guessed. "Bulls always make theater," Ledger said. Our job is to sell them an empty stage. In the Springfield yard, the playbill was exactly as warned. 3 bulls with fresh coats and colder tempers, a foreman who wore his whistle like a threat, and switch crews moving cars with the bored precision of men who'd been told to go faster for less. They stayed hidden 2 cars back from the paperwork, watching the choreography. Jack marked rhythms like a banker listening to a run on a teller line. Who spoke to whom, which section boss nodded which way, where a man could pass without putting a boot in a lie. A lantern wagged twice from the far side ladder, Hank's cousin, if the universe wasn't feeling perverse. Eddie lifted his chin, the tiny salute of men who won't wave in a yard. They waited 2 cars more because patience beats bravery 9 days out of 10. Then slipped down the ladder and into the narrow between of box and reefer, walking steel like it was a church aisle. Walk like you belong, Ledger murmured. Belong to air, hunger, and the God that looks away in yards. Hank's cousin turned out to be Clara, hair pinned under a cap. Jaw set to "Don't test me," switch iron on her shoulder like a staff Moses would envy. "You the hot box saints," she said, not smiling. "Hank said you smell trouble before it pops. We could use noses. Night needs 2 extra hands, 1 to set handbrakes on the old string, 1 to spot cars to the icing deck. Cash is poor. Payment is better." She jerked a thumb toward a shed where steam wrote its name on the air. "Soup and icehouse favors." Ledger didn't look at Jack to decide. He looked at Billy. The boy stood straighter, felt the question on his skin, and answered it without his mouth. "Work we can be proud of," Eddie said. "We'll take it." The night shift was honest and bitter. They learned the yard's grammar by call and answer, lantern up, break down, iron in, pin out. Jack's hands found their old confidence in numbers, counting cars under breath, checking the cut with a touch that became a ledger of safety. Eddie supervised like a sergeant with grace, close with boys and far from brag. Ledger moved where leverage was needed, shoulders remembering beams and joists, showing Billy the quick way to climb a ladder without waking a sleeping bruise. The icing deck was a white factory of winter. Men with picks cut blocks from the storage room, each one clear as gilt, and slid them down chutes into reefer bunkers. Jack had never seen ice treated like cargo for cargo. It felt like stocking a future with weather. Clara ran the crew like a captain who knew every nail by its first name. She didn't waste emotion, and she didn't waste a compliment. When Billy rigged a rope cradle to keep a bunker door from dropping and cracking a man's fingers, she gave him 1 nod that would carry him 10 miles. "You ride west after this?" she asked, stamping the deck, breath going up like smoke signals. "Northwest," Ledger said. "Cut toward Kansas City, then Omaha, Cheyenne if the line plays nice." Clara spit delicately into the snow. "Bulls and Casey think they're opera stars," she said. "They like a chorus. Don't give it to them." She scrawled on a scrap with carpenter's pencil and pressed it into Ledger's glove. "B-level west approach. Old coal bin shadow. 2 minutes between patrols. If a lantern snaps twice fast, that's me. If it snakes slow and arrogant, that's Girardi. He'll throw you into January just to see what sound you make." They finished under a sky that had traded stars for a bruise of cloud. The yard paid them in soup that tasted of bone and time, and $2 that looked like they'd done some living since last payday. Better than both, Clara put a bundle on the bench. 4 pairs of decent wool socks, 1 canvas roll-up with a yardman's kit, a folding rule, a stub of chalk, a pin lifter with good steel. "For the road," she said like a man saying amen. Back in their car, Ledger did the arithmetic out loud so Billy could hear it. $2 buys us coffee and a telegram if we had to. Socks buy us skin in March. The kit buys us time. Time's the only currency worth hoarding. They slept hard, the kind of sleep men earn, and woke to a sky that had picked a side. Grey low cloud pressed its palm to the land. The wind was different. Less talk, more shove. Eddie sniffed, then chewed the air like he could find the temperature's hiding place. "Whiteout coming," he said. "We choose where to be before it chooses for us." Whiteouts are not a storm so much as a decision by the world to erase its lines. Out past Marshfield, the horizon folded in. The slit showed white and more white and the ghosts of fence posts like lost teeth. Snow didn't fall. It just existed in the air in all directions, a fog of ice that made distance into a liar. Protocol? Billy asked, because he'd learned that word's comfort. Slow, Eddie said. Vent down to a whisper. Keep the Emberkin alive. No jumping between cars. No peeking for fun. We trust our measurements and not our eyes. Ledger laid down another lesson. Sound is map. Feel is compass. You put your hand to the wall and listen. The tone changes on bridges, curves, grades. You learn it now while the sight is a joke. They listened. The car's hum went lower on a grade, higher on a curve. The wind wrote on the boards. Big block letters when it hit broadside, cursive when it slid down the car's length. Jack leaned into the slit once, cautious, and got a handful of cold lies for his trouble. He pulled back, humbled, and counted his fingers because humility is better with arithmetic. Somewhere in that white, a reefer door ahead banged open, bad latch, worse luck. They heard it first as a new rhythm, then as a thud every 5 seconds, like a heartbeat learning the wrong song. Eddie's eyes narrowed. That's heat leaking, he said. If it slams long enough, meat goes south and a boss points fingers. The decision looked foolish in hindsight and correct in the moment. At the next creep, Eddie and Ledger tied themselves with Clara's good deck rope and slid out. Crouched along the catwalk, faces wrapped to coins. Jack belayed them like a ship, gloved hands paying out and taking in time with the thuds. The world was a white room with a floor that tried to tilt them into a myth. They reached the reefer bunker, wrestled the door against the wind's opinion, and Ledger drove the pin lifter through the hasp, the steel biting like a curse that likes you. He patted the door like a horse, and they crab-walked back, rope singing lightly against their belts. Inside, they were snowed men who'd learned a new respect. You'd make a good sailor, Jack told Eddie, handing him the ember can as if it could thank him. I get seasick in church, Eddie said, and the laugh that followed took the sting out of the cold. In the calm that whiteouts invent inside good shelters, they taught chalk talk. Ledger drew on the car wall with his pencil, a yard, a water stop, a chalk mark like a cat scratching. He sketched Hobo runes in a tight band, triangle, safe camp, crescent, hostile law, dot with 2 lines, goodwell, cross, mission with temper. Then he added their private notations, the ones iron. Mike had insisted they keep consistent from camp to camp. A tiny candle for draft. Solved. A small square with a notch for hinge fixed. An arrow, with S for Sally-level rations used here. Why right? Billy asked. We could just tell. Because we won't always be there when the man arrives who needs the story, Jack said. Chalk is a way to talk when your throat's busy staying alive. By afternoon, the white spoiled into gray and then thinned like bad soup. The land reappeared grumpy, fences slouching, cattle humped like commas. The train eased for a water stop beside a timber trestle where the river below had decided to remember movement. On the far side of the tank, a car of men in suits and hats stood like crows around a pile of sacks. They weren't bulls. They were the kind of men who always look like they're adding up how much mercy costs. A smaller figure stood with them, boy or girl, hard to say, under the coat, holding a basket that made Jack think of Sundays and hunger at the same time. Ledger watched without watching. Eddie watched openly. 2 of the men pointed toward the jungle sign someone had cut in a culvert. Triangle, arrow. One of them drew a line through it with a stick, another kind of chalk talk. No more here. Springfield's charity got stingy, Eddie said softly. When a town starts crossing out its triangles, winter gets teeth. They left an extra packet on the tank platform, Sally's grease candy wrapped in paper, under a plank where only a man who sweeps for scraps would look. Kindness wants to be specific. By night they were on a siding outside Ash Grove, a town that remembered it had once been a place and resented the proof. The siding kept them still long enough to see a lantern snake toward them, slow and arrogant. Clara's warning in Ledger's pocket warmed his ribs even through the cold. Girardi, the bull who liked to hear men make winter noises. Stage, Ledger murmured. Let's sell him a curtain. They shut the slit, killed the ember can to a glower only, and became a box of lumber. Footsteps crunched. Light stroked the door gap like a cat in a mean mood. A fist banged the wood and decided not to love it. The lantern sniffed and moved on. Somewhere 2 cars down, a door slid, and a voice tried to be brave and failed. Girardi's laugh had no humor to waste. Jack's hand tightened on the rope coil like he could tie a knot around a man's cruelty. Eddie's whisper was the thing that kept Jack from breaking his own rules. We live, we teach. We hold a grudge only if it becomes a tool. In the small hours, when even bulls sleep mean and wind rests its jaw, they took turns at the slit and saw the plains creep closer. Fewer trees, more sky. Snow in long, thoughtful drifts instead of tantrums. The car itself changed conversation, less sway from curves, more from distance. Ledger pressed Alice's letter under his palm like a seal on a map. Cheyenne by Thor, he said, barely above the creak of wood. Lines line up if we do. Casey next, Eddie said. Then Omaha or St. Joe, then Fremont, then the Platts ribbon right to the Rockies' doorstep. Big yards, big men, big chances to be small or smart. Billy, wrapped to his earlobes, spoke into the blanket. What's the rule for big yards? He asked. Same as for rivers and women, Ledger said without a smile, because respect needs a straight face. Don't guess, read, tie in. Keep your center. Leave it better than you found it. Jack lay back and let the rails write their metronome along his bones. He thought of Mare's ladle and Clara's nod and Iron Mike's candle and the boy in Ash Grove who would find a sweet under a tank plank when the cold told him nobody remembered him. He thought of Girardi's laugh and pictured hammering a hinge truer in some future jungle, until the laugh had somewhere humble to go. He slept and woke. Into dawn with color, the first smear of rose. The sky had admitted in 3 days. Missouri exhaled and gave them Kansas in the way borders do, not with a line but with a change in intentions. The wind had more room to think. The fields had less patience for trees. They were entering the part of the map where distances became honest and lies had to come up with better costumes. Eddie poured coffee so thin you could see future through it. Ledger counted the joints on the wall again with the pad of his thumb. Billy practiced a new knot, Clara's favorite for pin-lifter lashings. Jack sharpened the carpenter's pencil and wrote one small word under their chalk ledger. Practice. The car took the west like a compromise everyone could live with. Ahead lay Casey's opera, Omaha's calculations, and the long, flat sermon of the Platte. Behind lay Rolla and Springfield, and men with picks feeding ice to cargo like an investment in an April nobody trusted yet. Ready? Ledger asked no one and everyone. Ready, they said, and the rails agreed. Kansas eased them toward its biggest throat, where rails braided into the west bottoms and smoke stacked itself into weather. The car slowed under a ceiling of viaducts and iron catwalks, the kind of place where sound goes to practice being an echo. Ledger tapped the wall twice, his signal for every sense, and the four of them tightened their layers like boxers pulling laces before the bell. Clara's map, Eddie said, thumbing the folded scrap he'd kept near his chest. B-level west approach. Hold Colbin shadow. 2 minutes between patrols. Bulls here want applause, Ledger added. We leave them an empty house. The train drifted onto a siding that smelled like river and meatpacking and old ambition. Out the slit, the yard unrolled in hieroglyphs. Switch lanterns winking red-green like a gambler's lie. Men in peacoats moving with the self-importance of people paid to punish. Dogs learning the night shift's rumors. Above it all, the stockyards viaduct threw shadows like prison bars across the snow. They waited through one full cycle of patrol. 2 lanterns on the east catwalk. One on the grade crossing, a pair strolling lazy along the line that bled toward the core bridge. When the arrogant snake of light from Ash Grove's Girardi equivalent came nosing past, Ledger counted it down in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2. On 80, the lantern turned away toward a crew cutting a string. Now, Ledger breathed. They were down the ladder and into the Colbin's shadow in 3 heartbeats, backs to timber, faces still as signposts. Jack felt his body do what the last weeks had taught it. Minimize silhouette, plant your feet, become a fence post with a plan. Billy was between Eddie and Ledger, the safest geography a boy could ask for in a yard pretending to be a battlefield. Clara had promised a blind spot, and she hadn't lied. Patrol cadence flowed past them like a river that didn't know its banks had a kink. Ledger gave the tiniest nod and led them along the bin, over slag and cinder to the embankment where the line they wanted slid under the viaduct and out toward the river's black glitter. They crouched once as a lantern swept high, revealing only rust and the shrug of men not worth a story. When they reached the ladder of a westbound with its door yawned to a hand's width, Eddie tested the freeze on the roller with a gloved thumb. It gave. "Clara, you poet," he murmured, and they were in. They shut the door to a whisper and lay flat as the yard sang its opera. Whistles like tenors, couplers like bass drums, a chorus of insult from bulls who'd frightened easier prey. Their car took a breath, then another, then a step. The wheels found the beat, and Kansas City slid behind like a bad thought that stayed bad all the way to the river. The car bridge was a steel harp with ice for strings. Wind forced a tune through it that made Jack's molars hum. Ledger timed the rattles. Bridge beats are longer, steel flecks drawn out like a syllable in a sermon, and taught it aloud. Hear that. Count 9 and brace for the joint. Bridges lie about their ends. White swung in through the slit, river breath colder than land cold, sharp enough to make your nose remember every injury. Billy shivered, then stilled when Eddie's hand settled on his shoulder, a warm weight that said, "You're okay," without wasting oxygen. Past the bridge, the yards thinned to a freight district's backlots, then to a smudge of shops that still glowed like grudges, then to open fields with fences that appeared and disappeared in the weak light. Ledger relaxed one notch. "Opera's intermission," he said. "Next act, St. Joe if the sky plays nice. Otherwise, a siding with a personality." They ate on the move, Sally bars cracked into coins, bacon nickels thawed between finger and scarf, coffee so thin it was honesty itself. Jack felt the rhythm of hunger flatten and then climb again, the small hills of appetite timed to the song of the rails. Eddie watched Billy swallow and kept the teaching gentle.
Chew slow, he said.
"Your body's a stove with a damper. Don't flood it." They made St. Joseph toward afternoon, the river widening there like a man setting his shoulders. The town looked both proud and tired. It had been the jumping off for men who wanted to outrun the century before this one. Now it was a place to get a message moving if you said the right name at the right window. Ledger wanted a wire to Sacramento. That desire showed in the way he checked his pockets without looking at them. "We risk a jump?" Eddie asked. "Safer here than Omaha," Ledger answered. "Yards are human-sized. Bulls are cousin to annoyance, not art. We're up. We're back. We're gone." They waited until a water stop bled workers to the tank, then followed the back of a line of men like ghosts who understood parade routes. The telegraph office was warm enough to make your nose run, and decent in a way that made you think of homes not lost yet. A woman behind the window wore her hair in a roll, and her kindness as if it cost her nothing. She looked at Ledger's face like a good nurse takes a pulse. He slid 2 coins and the address through the slot with a nod that said "thank you" in a language that had to conserve syllables. He printed carefully. "Alice found Thomas stop. He with me stop learning winter. Stop will make Cheyenne by thaw. Stop love always. Pete." The clerk's eyes flicked fast. "You're late for Christmas," she said without a smile, which made it funnier. "I'll send this like it owes me money." "Bless you for being mean about it," Eddie said, and she grinned because compliments like that were better than tips in a winter this thin. They were walking back the long way. Shadows, alleys, the sides of buildings that smelled like flour and coal, when a boy peeled off from a group near the mission and fell in beside them like he'd been attached with twine. "Cap too thin, eyes too old. You Ledger?" he asked, panting, trying to pretend he wasn't. Ledger looked him over as if he were deciding whether to buy a used hammer. "Sometimes," he said. The boy stuck out a folded paper. "Man said if I saw a skinny carpenter with a face like a barn nail and the wrong coat, give him this," he blurted. "Said say Iron Mike says keep your head under the wind until Fremont." Ledger took the note, unfolded it, and read the small, tidy scrawl that spoke St. Louis even when it didn't sign its name. Ledger, bulls at Omaha looking to make quota in bones. Platte corridor is clear but hungry. Fremont jungle is cooking and quiet. Follow the river like a psalm, not a shortcut. Ledger broke the grease candy and gave the boy half, plus a sock rolled with $1 inside it because the world works better when surprises arrive warm. "Tell Mike the sermon's heard," he said. The boy nodded hard and vanished like he'd paid his debt to gravity. Back on the train, they found their car had acquired a draft, the door track iced, the wood shrinking like pride after a mistake. Jack rigged a wind flap from a feed sack and Clara's wire, overlapping it with newspaper cuffs and a strip of canvas that used to be a flower logo. Eddie lit the ember can off a charred sliver, coaxing it until it held a coal's orange thought. "Little things," he said. "Most deaths arrive in small uniforms." North into Nebraska, the sky got big in a way that felt like an argument. The snow went from tantrum piles to thoughtful drifts, long backs that lay down with the wind and dared the fences to tell them no. The Platte appeared like a rumor at first, dark through cottonwoods, then like proof. A dark ribbon with bright shoulders, too frozen to trust completely, too alive to ignore. "The Platte is a sermon," Eddie said, settling into the tone he used when he wanted something memorized. "It says one thing for a long time. You listen or you don't, but it won't change for your comfort." They followed it like men who understood church now. The main line ran west in the Rivers Company, Fremont, Columbus, Grand Island, Kearney, towns like a rosary. Each bead a water stop, a yard of reasonable size. A mission where the soup was honest or the sermon was. Ledger marked the sequence under his breath. Not superstition, but navigation. The first night by the Platte taught them a new cold. Not the knife wind of bridges or the teeth of urban damp, but a wide, even emptiness that leached heat like math. They tightened seams, lowered the vent to a thread, and invented a small trick Sally would have admired. A pebble-sized lump of bacon tucked into the ember can lid, giving off a breath of grease that perfumed the air and made the brain think food and the heart follow. Billy slept better for it, and you count that sort of science as a victory. At Fremont, the jungle was indeed cooking and quiet. Good draft, low smoke, men who nodded without asking your last name's politics. A woman called Ag, just Ag, short for Agatha or agriculture, no one asked, ran the stew pot and the tool bench with equal authority. "You Ledger?" she asked Ledger, which made Jack choke on a laugh. "Some days," he said again. Ag pointed with her chin at the hinge on the biggest shelter's door. "Squeals like a tattle," she said. "Fix it, and I'll trade you news and sugar." Ledger fixed it, of course he did, and the hinge swung afterward like it had been born generous. In return, Ag told them what winter had taught her about that stretch. Platte's ice looks like a floor until it doesn't. Stay on the south bank when you can. North cops on horseback think they're paintings. Bulls at Columbus are lazy, grateful for soup. Kearney's mission adds salt if you ask nice. Grand Island's doctor knows how to take a toe off without taking a man's will with it. Don't let him need to. Eddie left behind 3 soap cakes and a bag of nut meal, Sally's tax for good intelligence. Jack chalked their shorthand on the beam near the fire pit. 1, hinge true. Little candle, draft solved. S. Sally rations used well. Arrow west because the road demanded a sign that said, "Keep going." They rode on with the Platte to their left, like a thought you don't want to lose. Days came blue and mean, nights came black and honest. Once a coyote trotted the levee beside them for half a mile, eyeing the car like it was a cousin with poor manners. Billy named him Mr. Ink because he moved like a spill. Ledger forbade names for wild things and then failed to enforce it because the boy needed a friend who wasn't risking frostbite. Somewhere past Grand Island, a false sun appeared, halo above the real one. Rainbow ghosts on either side like coins slipped in by the weather. "Sundogs," Eddie said. "Good for stories, bad for hope. Means cold on top of cold. We do the drills." They did. Layer check, vent measure, ember can discipline, ration count. Jack ran his fingers along the wall and listened for the tone change that meant a crack had opened in a seam. Billy replaced the paper cuff at the door with a fresh wrap he'd pre-cut from a mission handbill. Ledger retied the corner lash with Clara's favorite hitch and made Billy show it back to him in the dark, by feel alone. "You don't always get eyes," he said. "Hands can see when the world can't." They found a man outside Kearney who had not learned those lessons soon enough. He lay in the corner of a car that had decided to be an icebox. He breathed barely. Fingers were black to the first knuckle. Eddie didn't pick up the pity. He picked up the protocol, warmed the core, not the limbs yet. They stripped the man gently, wrapped his chest in dry newsprint, laid him between Jack and Ledger, and dripped Sally broth into his mouth with patience that would have shamed a church. The man woke once and said his name like he'd forgotten it, Milo, and whimpered when sensation came back like bees. They handed him to Grand Island's doctor with instructions and a packet of grease candy to feed the boys. Brain while the feet decided how much they needed to apologize. The doctor, curl of mustache, hands like walnut, looked at Ledger like a peer. "You ride?" he asked. "I build," Ledger said. "On trains." "Same thing," the doctor replied. And the two men nodded in a fraternity the rest of the world hadn't bothered to join. Nights lengthened, and then, imperceptibly, began to give back a minute here, a minute there. They were the kind of minutes that don't warm your face but do warm your thoughts. Ledger took Alice's letter out less for reassurance and more to check his own promise against the map under his ribs. "By Thor," he whispered. "The line says yes if we stay boring. Boring saved lives." They didn't play hero at Columbus when a drunk bull wanted an argument. They chose the next train. They didn't cross the Platte on a footbridge slick to glass to save a mile. They walked the long bank with their dignity intact. They skipped a free stew when the mission smelled of disease and paid a nickel at a boarding house window for a bowl of potatoes and grease that tasted like survival. Talking at night changed too. At first it had been instruction and stories. Now it included planning that felt like a future, not just a route. "Cheyenne's yards are busy even in winter," Eddie said one evening as the car clicked off distance with a metronome's clean conscience. "We may catch a Western and Atlantic cut if the dispatcher is generous." "Cheyenne by thaw," Ledger repeated, tasting the words as if they were coffee from a better year. "Then letters and decisions." Jack kept his answer tucked close. He pictured California like a story taken out of a pocket and unfolded on a kitchen table. He pictured Sacramento's cannery smell and a workshop that had been waiting like a faithful dog. He pictured himself at a bench as Ledger's shadow and then not a shadow. And some nights he pictured a different bench, a cold one, in a jungle teaching boys with newsprint and rope and the kind of knowledge that travels better than money. He didn't have to decide yet. The rails had a way of deciding when deciding time arrived. For now, river, yard, stew, chalk, sleep, wake. Breath that smoked in the slit and vanished into Nebraska's honest air. Past Kearney, the land began to roll in thoughts instead of hills, and the Platte split into braids, like a story becoming more itself. The car spoke in longer vowels, and the wind said fewer clever things. "We're headed up country now," Eddie said, toward a sky that leans. "You'll feel it in your jaw." Ledger closed his eyes and ran his palm along the wall. "Bridges soon," he said. "Longer ones, iron that remembers the men who built it. We keep our heads low and our gratitude high." Late the next afternoon, a signboard leaned out of the winter with a name like a plan. North Platte. Yard hands in coats hammered by prairie wind walked like they knew it by its first name. A telegraph office offered messages to cities that seemed like myths from this cold. A jungle under the cottonwoods carried a thin column of smoke that went up with no hurry. Ag's cousin, it turned out, ran that place with a soft voice and a sharp inventory. "Eat first," he said as they came in, "and then you can tell me how many hinge squeals you fix before I find you a bunk." Ledger grinned. Eddie groaned happily. Billy sat so fast you'd think the bench had pulled him down. Jack chalked the same 3 symbols he'd been chalking for a week. Hinge true, draft solved, Sally's arrow, and added a 4th without thinking, a small, careful heart inside a square. He noticed it after he drew it and shook his head, amused at himself. "What's that?" Billy asked. "Means the shelter kept its promises," Jack said. "Means we remember that." Night fell clean and hard, a western night with more stars than excuses. They lay shoulder to shoulder, 5 breaths where there had been 4, and listened to the yard couple cars like a priest counting beads. Ledger spoke last, words aimed at the dark with a carpenter's economy. "Cheyenne is 3 more long days if the gods of switches are awake. We keep doing the small things right," Eddie chuckled. Small things right is the only religion I ever kept. Billy, half asleep, mumbled, "What's Cheyenne again?" Ledger answered without teasing. "A town where a letter becomes a voice," he said. "A place where we decide who we are after winter stops trying to name us." Jack let that settle in. Out beyond the cottonwoods, the Platte turned under its ice with patient muscles. The rails hummed evidence that distance can be made into a friend. Above, the sky looked like it had been wiped down for company. The sermon wasn't over, not by a mile, but he knew the lines now, and the chorus and the rests between. Tomorrow the line would pull them west again. Not safely, not easily, but together, and together was a heat of its own. Morning cracked like a knuckle over North Platte, and the rails invited them west with a confidence that made promises carefully. The sky had the clean enamel blue you only get after nights that argue well below zero. Breath plumed, canvas whispered, and the car answered each bump with the authority of timber that had made it through more winters than Ledger had scars. 3 long days, Eddie said, rubbing the edge of his ear until it remembered blood. "Keep the small commandments. They've carried us this far." They followed the Platte as it braided wider and then began to lose its patience, splitting into channels that suggested choices nobody wanted. Towns slid by like beads on the rosary they'd begun. Lexington, Cozad, Gothenburg, each with a water stop. A mission that smelled of potatoes and faith. A yard boss whose anger waxed and waned with how his breakfast had gone. Ledger's chalk ledger grew denser, houses where hinges stopped snitching, a candle where drafts forgot themselves. For every place Sally's grease candy had turned a man's thoughts back toward living. By Ogallala, the river was more rumor than road. Cottonwoods thinned. Grass forgot it had once been tall. Wind learned to sprint. The car's voice changed, longer vowels, fewer apologies, and Eddie grinned despite himself. "You can hear elevation," he said. "Air gets stingy and wood gets honest." With elevation came a new enemy that arrived dressed as a friend, sun. Reflected off hard snow, it hammered the eyes until men saw things that looked like hope and weren't. "Suit up," Ledger ordered, and they blackened cheekbones like warriors from a tribe composed entirely of hungry men. He cut new slit masks from a mission sheet that had sermon points sharp enough to cut rope. He joked about learning something through osmosis, and the laughter warmed the shelter the way good jokes always do. At Sydney, a wind came out of the west with a sly warmth, the Chinook, the prairie's trickster. Snow softened at the edges. Eaves began to cry. Jackets felt too heavy for an hour and then not heavy enough. Billy stuck his face toward the slit and smiled like a boy at summer. Eddie dragged him back by the collar with love disguised as a scold. "Chinook romances," he said. "They give you a kiss and pick your pocket. You sweat in your layers, then the wind goes back to January and the sweat becomes a coffin. Learn the flirt, don't marry it." They rigged for fickle weather, vents set to breathing, not boasting. Layers loosened one notch with dry paper staged and ready. Ember can lit to a cat's eye glow instead of a sermon. Jack showed Billy the quick change. Replace damp paper in 3 hand-width panels, never exposing more than a square foot of skin at a time. Billy nailed it by the 3rd try. Ledger nodded once, the way a good carpenter signs off on a joint. That afternoon, a freight ahead stalled on a drift that had ideas above its station. Word came back down the line in hand circles and impatient curses. Wait for the plow. Men peered out along the tops of cars and judged distances like gamblers study faces. An hour later, a rotary plow shouldered into view, a steel sunflower throwing snow in a 10-foot bloom. The sound was half him, half sawmill. Billy's eyes went wide and stayed that way. "Looks like a carnival ride," he said. "It's a factory that sells forward," Eddie answered. "Remember it that way. Tools are cheerful or cruel depending on which side you're on." They rolled again in the plow's wake, and by dusk, Sydney was a memory with stew attached to it. The night asked for new precautions. High Plains cold is less insult and more arithmetic. It simply subtracts until you're a remainder. Eddie set a candle behind the ember can lid. "Tin stove," he called it, turning a single flame into a more generous radiance by trapping and reflecting it. Ledger rigged an inner curtain from flour sacking, half-wall 2 feet in from the door, creating a vestibule where snow could fall and melt without sneaking into the bedding. Jack inventoried calories like a man counting votes. Grease candy at watches, he said. Meat slivers on the hour. Coffee when it buys us attention, not when it buys us false courage. They shared the watches 2 and 2, Ledger with Billy first, Eddie with Jack second. On Ledger's shift, the older man talked knots in whispers, a bowline tied blind, a trucker's hitch tension to the rhythm of breath. On Eddie's, he taught Jack a field check for frost nip. Pinch, pressure, count to 5. If the skin blushed back slow, you warmed it with palm heat and patience. If it stayed white and dumb, you called it by its right name and acted. Morning found them at Pine Bluffs, where Wyoming begins by shrugging and offering you more sky. The telegraph shack wore its smoke like a scarf. Ledger's face went still the way it did when Hope asked to sit down. We send another? Jack asked. Or receive, Eddie said, and the word hung for a heartbeat like a lantern before a door opens. Inside the shack, the operator had the narrow focus of a man who talks to far away without lifting his voice. Ledger slid the stub from St. Joe under the window. The operator frowned at his ledger and then brightened. Reply came through Ogallala. We chased you west, he said, shuffling paper like cards that mattered. He passed it to Ledger with a respect you don't counterfeit. Ledger read without breathing, then read again with the kind of breath people call prayer when they mean gratitude and fear at once. Pete, received your wire. Stop, Thomas. Safe is best word I have heard in 3 years. Stop. Come when roads kinder or send place we will meet. Stop. Shop keeps your tools dusted. Stop. Love you always and still. Alice Ledger closed his eyes and saw for just a second some other room. He pressed the paper to his lips in a gesture so quick even modesty missed it. When he looked up, the years were still there, but the load had moved. She didn't write forgive, Eddie observed softly. She wrote still. That's heavier and better. Ledger's voice was roughened oak. We make Cheyenne. We answer like men with a plan. He tore the bottom of the sheet and printed a reply in block letters stiff with feeling held in check. Alice, Cheyenne, next 2 days. Stop, we'll write full from there. Stop, we come in spring if we can buy decent seats. Stop bringing Thomas and a friend who learned winter well. Stop, love always. Pete, the operator tapped it out with quick fingers and a small smile. Good message, he said. You got the shape of a return in it. They climbed back aboard with a letter that made the shelter feel warmer without changing the temperature. Billy read the message twice and then pretended he hadn't. The boy was learning privacy like he learned knots. Jack felt something move in his chest in a way he hadn't allowed since Chicago, a small, stubborn belief that a man might belong to something besides weather and schedule. They crossed into Wyoming mid-morning, the state line unmarked except by the wind deciding it could run faster here. Hills rose from the prairie like shoulders. The color of distance shifted from blue to a strange green you only see when the air is dry enough to break. Cheyenne announced itself with ladders of track and a water tank with the sort of pride few towns can still afford. Roundhouses hunched like turtles. A row of false front buildings squared their jaws against a wind that had hired itself out to February full-time. Ledger's plan was simple. Jungle first, letter second, work third. The Cheyenne jungle was set in a cut of cottonwoods that had grown patient the way men do when they can't afford nerves. The camp had a low, smart profile, fire pits half buried, wind walls that looked like accidents of brush until you stood behind them and realized they were choirs. A woman named Dot ran it with the efficient kindness of a nurse who had learned to keep score. You, Ledger, she said without asking. Iron Mike wired. He sends respect and a list. She handed Ledger a folded page. Hinges here, draft flaps there, a new boy needs knot school, the infirmary needs soap, the stew needs fat if anyone can spare it. There were no exclamation points. Winter didn't need them. They went to work because the work was there. Ledger tuned doors until they closed like promises. Eddie gave a lecture on frostnip in the infirmary that was half medicine and half morale. Jack took 3 boys, One from Pueblo with a bruised pride, one from Omaha with ears too big for his hat, Billy, and taught the newspaper rap like a catechism. He used Sally's corrections exactly, the way she'd taught him. Overlap to the wind, cuff the wrists, never squeeze a limb so tight it forgets its job. By the end, the boys moved like apprentices. By the next day, they'd be teachers who didn't know that was what they were yet, after stew, thick with barley and a rabbit that had lost an argument with a snare. Ledger sat at a plank set on sawhorses and wrote like the man he had been before rails became his mailing address. He told Alice truths without makeup. The cold, the small economies, the boys they'd pulled back from the edge, the quiet ways a camp functioned when pride had to stand aside for competence. He wrote Thomas's name 3 times, once with pride, once with apology, once with a hope he didn't blunt. He wrote Jack's name once and called him friend, a word men spent carefully in winter. He sealed the letter and slid it into his breast pocket like a heart's backup. "Morning," he said. "We mail before bulls get their coffee." Bulls in Cheyenne wore their brutality with less drama and more commitment. Dot knew their roots the way Clara had. "South side blind 10 minutes on the hour," she said. "Take the drainage ditch. You'll look like a pipe, which is what you want to be." They posted the letter at a window where a clerk's fingers moved like a pianist picking out scales. Ledger bought 2 government envelopes and a small book of stamps with a bison that looked like it was ready to charge. He tucked the bison away. "Tickets later," he said out loud to no one. Work found them while they were deciding the day's chores. A troop train pulled in, frost rhyming the coach steps, boys in olive drab steaming like horses. They were bound for a fort that promised to turn them into the kind of men who could sleep outdoors on purpose. A steward yelled about a broken stove damper. "We either fix it or eat cold," he said. "Both will produce opinion." Ledger climbed up with his tool roll. Inside, heat and faces, both too young and too old. He traced the damper rod, found the hitch where rust and neglect had formed an alliance, shaved a sliver off the binding with a file that had seen more winters than any boy in the car. The damper swung, the stove drew, cheer lived again in the aisle. The steward tried to press coins on him. Ledger shook his head and took coffee instead. "We sell forward," he said. "Same as your engineer." Jack parted from Dot a sack of potatoes and a promise to trade hinge work for fat. He spent an hour teaching a farmhand from Idaho how to cut a sacking booty to slip over worn leather. A muckluck, Sally style, stuffed with dry straw and paper, tied at the calf with a hitch that came apart even when your hands were stupid with cold. The farmhand wept a little when his toes remembered they were invited to the party. Word spread the way it does when relief walks through a camp. Men and boys came with problems that looked small until late March. A cup with no handle, a strap with no hole, a question about how to sleep with 2 men in a shelter without anybody feeling foolish. Ledger's answers were not clever so much as correct. "Drill a new hole," he said. "Braid 3 strings into a better one. Put the smallest man in the middle and call it a stove." The rightness of it was a kind of food. The day reached its blue hour. Shadows lengthened the way stories do when men sit closer to fires. Ledger's laugh appeared twice in the same evening. That was an omen Jack filed under good. Billy spent his grease candy on a kid who'd tried to bully him that morning and failed. The kid blushed, which is how you know redemption isn't mythical. Eddie took pulse after pulse with 2 fingers and declared victory every time a beat came back a little stronger. Under a sky that had finally remembered mercy, Jack walked the edge of camp and practiced a confession to himself. California was not a myth now. It was a train of tickets and a table and a woman who dusted tools. He could go with them and be a bench hand who learned plane and chisel under a master who had hammered his soul back into a shape that could carry love. He could send money east, write letters that smelled faintly of shellac and roast chicken, build cabinets that closed like truth, or he could ride spring north with the plat-turning honest and teach more boys the paper wrap in, culverts that didn't deserve to be churches and tie, more hinges true in shelters built from the lumber of old freight dreams. He could become a rumor the way Ledger was, known by face and first name, chalk shorthand for someone cared enough to leave a better lash here. The choice didn't ask to be made tonight. Winter taught respect for timing. He sat by Ledger and Eddie and Billy and watched stars show up like guests who always arrive when soup runs low. Dot set out a tin of salt like a crown. Someone told a joke about bulls and curtains. Someone else sang half a verse of a hymn about home and left the last line for the fire to finish. Ledger spoke to the air without sounding foolish. "We kept the small commandments," he said. "That's what got us here." Eddie stretched his hands to the coals, palms nicked with a dozen stories. That and good people who like being asked to do something useful. Billy yawned a kid's yawn and put his head on his rolled coat. "What's next?" he asked, eyes already closing. Ledger looked toward the line that would take them farther west if they asked nicely. He looked toward the telegraph window where a bison on a stamp waited like a promise. He looked at Jack so that both futures could be seen and respected. "Next," he said, "we mail our breath to Sacramento and see if it comes back warmer. We fix what hinges squeal. We walk boys out of Whiteouts. We wait for roads to soften. We buy tickets on purpose. We keep our hands and our word and our willingness to teach." Cheyenne's wind shifted then, just enough to let Heat stand up straight. In the corner shelter they'd tuned for Dot. The door swung and caught and sealed the way a sentence ends with certainty. Jack put his palm to the wood, felt the truth of it, and smiled into the dark where choices were for once. Not traps, but doors. If you're listening to this under a good blanket with a roof that keeps its promises, you're the inheritor of their small commandments. Keep them, overlap to the wind. Vent a breath even when cold says greed. Count steps in the dark and trust the knot you can tie blind. Trade what you have for what someone needs and call that profit. Chalk a mark where a stranger can find it. Leave a hinge truer than you found it. And when the weather and the rails and the year turn their worst faces to you, remember what kept those men alive on nights when even steel shivered. The railroad doesn't care if you freeze. The weather doesn't care if you starve. The only warmth you own is what you make and what you pass. Knowledge is a fire. Share it.